Our story begins with the destruction of Ragnar's castle, known as Rose Palace. The people of the palace, servants, guards, and knights, are killed one by unknown assailants. They are hopelessly cut down, while our protagonist, Theo Ragnar, struggles to stand against one of the enemies. Theo swings his sword upward, forcing his opponent back. The man raises his sword and brings it down, but Theo manages to block the strike just in time. The Ragnar clan is a Grand Ducal family responsible for guarding the empire's northernmost borders. Their power comes from a unique constitution said to be inherited from dragons. For over 1,000 years, the Ragnar clan has served as the empire's great northern wall. Every member of the Ragnar bloodline is born with extraordinary magic, stamina, and skill in swordsmanship, everyone except Theo Ragnar. Despite his lineage, Theo possesses none of the talents that define his family. In the midst of battle, Theo is stabbed in the stomach and falls to his knees. His opponent taunts him, saying that, even at the end, Theo still doesn't understand. He tells Theo that no matter how hard he tries, there are some things he simply cannot achieve. People call it a lack of talent. The man then removes his mask, revealing himself as Rendon, someone Theo knows. Shocked, Theo demands to know why Rendon has done this. Rendon, unfazed, mocks Theo further. He says it was pitiful to watch Theo train every morning, knowing that all his effort would never get him anywhere. Rendon laughs cruelly, telling Theo that he was the perfect imbecile of Ragnar, someone who should have stayed hidden away because he had no talent. Rendon found it laughable to watch Theo struggle to make something of himself. Anger surges through Theo as he clenches his teeth and forces himself to stand. He demands to know if Rendon only became his sword instructor to betray him and sell out Rose Palace. In response, Rendon slashes Theo's arm, causing him to scream in pain as his blood splatters everywhere. With a sigh, Rendon asks why Theo blames him. He grabs Theo's hair, pulling his head up, and tells him that everything happening is his own fault. Rendon questions why Theo can't see it. With blurred vision, Theo hears Rendon tell him to look ahead and understand why Rose Palace is burning and why his family is dying. Another man approaches, dragging a woman and throwing her at Theo's feet. Rendon cruelly asks why his mother has become a cold, lifeless corpse. Theo is stunned and horrified to see his mother dead in front of him. Rendon tells him once more that all of this is happening because Theo is the weakest in the Ragnar clan, a clan ruled by strength. In his anguish, Theo whispers Rendon's name, grabs the sword in front of him, and swings it in a fury. But before he can strike, a sword is thrown at him, stabbing him in the chest. He falls to the ground. As blood pools beneath him, the man beside Rendon scolds him for talking too much and orders him to finish the job. Rendon apologizes, saying he was merely reminiscing but is nearly done. Theo, lying on the ground, wonders what Rendon means by done. Is this truly the end? Regret washes over him as he realizes he couldn't protect anyone or accomplish anything. As everything burns around him, he wonders if things would have been different if he had only possessed talent. Tears fall from his eyes as he closes them in pain, consumed by the flames alongside his servants, his mother, and the place he loved. Suddenly, a system message appears: you have died. Your trait has activated, and you are returning to the regression point. Theo opens his eyes, confused, to find himself face to face with Rendon once again, who casually remarks that he seems tired. Rendon suggests they end the lesson for the day, but Theo is stunned and disoriented. He doesn't respond, wondering if what he just experienced was real. Did he really die? Rendon, noticing Theo's silence, comments on how absent-minded he seems. Theo, lost in thought, wonders if his death was real and if he is now flashing back to his life. He can't believe that Rendon's face, of all things, is what he's seeing in these final moments. With a sigh, he thinks that even death has a cruel sense of humor. But then, a system message pops up in front of him. It reads, Tutorial Quest Number 1, Punch Rendon in the face. Theo looked at Rendon, wondering what in the world was happening. Was this really how flashbacks were supposed to work? He glanced back and forth between Rendon and the system message, quickly realizing that Rendon couldn't see it. Rendon asked him what was wrong, but Theo, still in shock, let go of his wooden sword. His fist trembled as he thought that, despite not understanding what was going on, perhaps this was a gift from the gods, a chance to vent his frustration before it was all over. With that thought, Theo launched his fist at Rendon, thinking that if this was a dream, he might as well give Rendon a good pummeling. His punch landed squarely on Rendon's face, stopping everyone in their tracks. But to Theo's surprise, the punch didn't even hurt Rendon. He was left wondering why the dream felt so real, yet his punch was so weak. Rendon, unfazed, swung his wooden sword forward and struck Theo in the shoulder, sending him flying to the ground. As Theo slammed into the dirt, Rendon scolded him, reminding him that he had said their lesson was over. Theo winced in pain, confused. Was he supposed to feel pain in a dream? Rendon sighed and told him that he understood Theo's frustration, especially with the awakening ceremony fast approaching. But that didn't excuse a student lashing out at his master. Theo was taken aback. Awakening ceremony. What was Rendon talking about? Disappointed, Rendon added that as a member of the Ragnar family, Theo should have used his sword, not his fists. Rendon then walked away, telling Theo that he would see him at their next lesson. But Theo remained seated, lost in thought, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The nearby knights snickered and taunted him, calling him an imbecile. They mocked him for attacking his master and questioned if he was even truly a Ragnar, saying he was too incompetent even for an illegitimate child. Theo touched his face, feeling the lingering pain, and grabbed a handful of sand. He couldn't believe how real the sensations were. It wasn't a flashback. This was reality. He recalled that the awakening ceremony was supposed to take place 10 years ago, which made him wonder if he had somehow returned to when he was 17. How was this even possible? Just then, the system appeared again, congratulating him on completing tutorial quest number 1. As a reward, it informed him that his Ragnar's talent had been activated. Theo was confused, staring at the system message, but when it asked if he wanted to claim his reward, he hesitantly raised his hand and clicked yes. Immediately, a bright light surged from his body, and the system displayed that his stats were increasing at an incredible rate. Bewildered, Theo could only wonder what the hell is going on. Later, in Rose Palace, in the guest room, Rendon Harvey, Theo's swordsmanship tutor, reports on Theo's progress. He comments that he has never seen someone so devoid of talent, but adds that this is precisely why he is there, the true teacher, Rendon. He swears that he will do his best to prepare Theo for the awakening ceremony, which is only 5 months away. Lady Cecilia Ragnar, the mistress of Rose Palace and Theo's mother, agrees with Rendon, entrusting Theo's training to him. She hands him a bag of gold coins, asking Rendon to give Theo a bit more attention. Rendon replies confidently, assuring her that he already plans to teach Theo day and night, so she needn't worry. Cecilia, however, clarifies that she isn't concerned because she believes in Theo. As Rendon leaves the guest room, he mutters to himself that Cecilia will have to worry. Although he isn't truly training Theo properly, it's still true that Theo lacks talent. He scoffs, calling Cecilia a concubine and thinking to himself that like mother, like son, their bloodline won't lead anywhere. Still, Rendon finds the situation ideal. He's receiving an excellent salary and has the title of tutor to the Ragnar family's direct line. As a reward for secretly sabotaging Theo's growth and feeding information to a mysterious benefactor, Rendon knows his future is secure. He smirks, thinking that Theo, the imbecile of Ragnar, will unwittingly be his ticket to success. Suddenly, Rendon spots someone running toward him at high speed. It's Theo. Rendon sneers, calling him the imbecile, but Theo runs past him without a word. Angered, Rendon mutters, calling Theo an idiotic loser. Theo rushes to the guest room and calls out to his mother. Cecilia, looking up, smiles sweetly and comments that he must be tired from training. But instead of answering, Theo throws his arms around her, hugging her tightly. Surprised, Cecilia stammers, asking why he's acting this way. Tears well up in Theo's eyes as he confirms to himself that he truly has returned to 10 years in the past. He vividly recalls Rendon forcing him to look at his mother's dead body in his previous life, helpless to do anything. But now, he feels immense joy to see her alive. Cecilia, confused, looks down at her son. Theo knows he must change the future. He's still weak and powerless at the moment, but if that mysterious system window is real, he can become strong enough to hold his own in the inevitable war for the throne. Hugging his mother tightly, he silently vows to become strong enough to exact revenge on Rendon. At that moment, the system displays his second tutorial quest, Train Your Body to the Limit. Determined, Theo heads to the training ground, running laps with a singular focus, revenge against Rendon. However, he knows that with his current weak body, he can't do anything. He must prioritize getting stronger first. As he runs, he remembers the intelligence agency he became involved with in his previous life, Black Word. Although he had been relegated to the information team due to his lack of skill, he never expected that the information he gathered back then would become so useful now. That information was about a powerful elixir known as the Bloody Sword Emperor's Elixir. Its true value would only be revealed in the future through a secret manual, and Theo realizes that, combined with extreme training, it might be his key to strength. Hours pass, and as the sun begins to rise, Theo is still running, not having rested once. Yet, he feels strong, thinking that everything is possible now because of his activated Ragnar talent and the system window. The system shows him that he has made 27% progress toward his goal of 100%. One of the knights training nearby notices Theo and asks how many laps he has completed without a break, remarking that Theo seems far fitter than before. Theo grabs a nearby wooden sword, determined to push himself harder. He resolves to run as far as he can and swing the sword more than he ever has before. Only then can he truly become powerful this time. As he trains, the system updates his progress. He has reached 65% of his goal. A few days later, Theo was still in the training ground, relentlessly swinging his sword without rest. Evelyn Narravel, the manager of training ground number 4, sat at the top, yawning with a cigar in hand. She noticed that Theo had been training non-stop for several days and wondered if he was truly the imbecile of Ragnar as people said. Staring at him, she began to doubt whether someone so dedicated could really be talentless. Theo, on the other hand, was completely exhausted, barely catching his breath, and felt as though he was going to die. But when the system displayed that he had reached 97% completion, he forced himself to keep going, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He remembered the night before when, after reaching 90% progress, he had laid down briefly to rest. To his shock, the percentage had dropped. He hadn't expected the system to penalize him for taking a break, and it pushed him to keep moving without rest until morning. Despite his disbelief, the system had goaded him into continuing until he could no longer breathe. Hours later, as he hit 98%, Theo ran forward with the wooden sword, swinging it forcefully. Knowing he was almost there, he pushed harder, jumping around the training ground with increasing speed. As he reached 99%, he summoned every last ounce of strength, convincing himself that he just needed a little more. Evelyn watched in disbelief, her mouth open, as Theo pushed through his pain and exhaustion. Finally, he reached 100%. The moment he saw the number appear, he stopped, completely losing his balance from the overwhelming fatigue. While the system congratulated him on completing tutorial quest number 2, the system displayed his rewards and bonuses, but his vision was so blurred that he couldn't make them out. He collapsed to the ground, trembling, as the system asked if he wanted to claim his rewards now. Without seeing them clearly, Theo reached out with a shaking hand and managed to click yes. As soon as he did, he passed out, while a brilliant light entered his body. A powerful gust of air surged around him, and Evelyn, witnessing the event, was shocked. Later, Theo woke up, immediately sitting upright when he realized he was in a room. Evelyn entered and reassured him, explaining that he was in the break room of training ground number 4. She added that even a Ragnar would collapse if they pushed themselves as hard as he had. He recognized her, which surprised Evelyn, though she introduced herself properly. She explained that he had lost consciousness while training alone in the morning, so she had moved him there to recover. Theo thanked her, understanding the situation. Evelyn handed him a glass of water, then asked if he knew that within the Ragnar clan, opening one's mana hall before the awakening ceremony was strictly forbidden. Theo, still confused, replied, yes. Evelyn then pressed further, saying that he should also be aware of the consequences of breaking that rule. Theo, puzzled, asked why she was suddenly bringing this up. Evelyn's tone grew serious as she explained that right before he lost consciousness, a mana wave had occurred, one that aligned with the opening of a mana hall. Theo was taken aback, and she asked if he had perhaps opened his mana hall, addressing him as young Master Theo Ragnar. Theo was left wondering what she meant by this, knowing that if he had opened his mana hall, he shouldn't have survived. But then, he felt something within him and recalled the system notification. He had obtained a dragon heart as a reward. He also remembered that as a bonus reward for his fast completion of the quest, he had received the magic power equivalent to 10 years of his past life. Stunned and in disbelief, Theo couldn't fathom that he now possessed a dragon heart. Dragon heart. A mana hall can be placed within a dragon's heart, and doing so makes it operate far more efficiently. However, humans, not being dragons, place their mana halls in the lower abdomen because the human heart cannot handle the burden. This is why every warrior, especially those like the Ragnar clan, longs for a dragon's heart. It's seen as a shortcut to overwhelming power. But humans have never been able to overcome their natural limitations, until now. With the dragon heart granted to Theo, he found himself in a precarious situation. Theo knew that Evelyn Narravel was no ordinary person. A high-rank swordsman, she had retired after losing her left arm and now managed training ground number 4. However, she had once been the commanding officer of the white-armored dragon cavalry, so respected that even the demon dragon of the cavalry adored her. She was renowned for her principles, not caring for status or strength, and she could not tolerate dishonesty or cowardice. Theo recalled that, in his previous life, when he had been stubborn, Evelyn had relinquished her position as his direct master. In other words, if Evelyn discovered the truth about his dragon heart and the mana hall within it, she would report him for execution without hesitation. But then Theo smirked, wondering if he could outmaneuver her without getting caught. In a calm but serious tone, Theo asked Evelyn if she could handle the consequences of accusing him, an heir of Ragnar, of breaking such a grave rule based solely on her suspicions. Her momentary feelings could lead to his execution, but her principles might also trap her. Evelyn, stunned, listened as Theo reminded her that if she were wrong, accusing him without proof would mean defiling the Ragnar name, to which she agrees. When he seriously asked her what the punishment was for such a crime, she replied, execution. Theo praised her knowledge of the rules and provocatively suggested she go ahead and check for herself. Evelyn, unnerved, studied his expression, uncertain about what she was feeling. Could Theo really be that kind of person? She released her power, convinced there had been a mana wave, and angrily prepared to check his abdomen, believing there could be no exceptions to the rules. But when she looked, there was no mana hall. Confused, she started to wonder if she had been mistaken. Still, the possibility seemed impossible to her. Theo, seeing her confusion, casually asked, "Is there no mana hall?" Realizing her error, Evelyn immediately knelt before him, shouting for him to execute her as punishment for her wrongful accusation. She explained that she had been wrong and would pay for her sin with her life. But Theo, smiling, knew there could be no mana hall visible because dragon hearts were different. A dragon heart's mana hall could be controlled and hidden at will by its user. And since the fact that humans could possess a dragon heart wouldn't be known for several years, Evelyn would never suspect the truth. Theo reached out to her, but instead of punishing her, he simply tapped her shoulder and told her there was no need for such actions. This shocked Evelyn. As Theo turned to walk away, he calmly remarked that she had done what she thought was right, and that there were few people brave enough to risk their life to demand the truth from an heir of Ragnar. Theo recognized Evelyn's strength and realized it would benefit him to erase her debt to him. He then explained to her that the reason opening one's mana hall before the ceremony was forbidden was out of fear that it might overflow. He added that it was kind of amusing that she had been worried about him, the so-called bastard of Ragnar, overflowing his mana hall. He thanked her for her concern and care, leaving her stunned, the cigar still unused in her mouth. As Theo walked out of the training grounds break room, he thought about his dragon heart and the 10 annuals, or 10 years worth of magic power from his past life, that the system had given him. He was now certain that he could become overwhelmingly powerful in this life. A few days later, Rendon shouted at Theo, telling him that his sword swing wasn't right, and that he needed to adjust it more to the right. Rendon, growing frustrated, asked how many times he had to repeat himself. Theo thought it was nice that he was getting stronger, but pretending to be weak while enduring Rendon's lessons was exhausting. He glanced at Rendon, calling him a bastard in his mind, realizing that Rendon was subtly, yet deliberately, teaching him flawed sword techniques. As Rendon tried to adjust his grip, Theo became more certain that there was someone pulling the strings behind Rendon's actions. He knew he had to uncover the identity of the mastermind behind his murder. Suddenly, an idea came to Theo, and he smiled, confident that he could handle the situation. He called out to Rendon, who quickly snapped, reminding Theo that chatting during lessons was prohibited. Before Rendon could finish his scolding, Theo snapped the wooden sword in his hands and calmly told him that he couldn't continue with the lesson because it was utter nonsense. Angry, Theo demanded to know how Rendon had managed to become a mid-rank swordsman with such poor skills, speculating that his commission had likely been to act as Theo's instructor to keep an eye on him. Theo continued, mockingly suggesting that Rendon would struggle even against low-ranked demonic beasts. Rendon, visibly shaking with anger, asked Theo to repeat what he had just said. But Theo doubled down, stating clearly that Rendon's skills were garbage. As Theo considered the situation, he thought that the best course of action was to force Rendon to resign. Rendon, furious, shouted, calling Theo young master in frustration. But Theo remained calm, believing that if things escalated, Rendon would have to contact the mastermind. Later, at Camellia Palace, a knight excitedly called out to someone named Action, asking if he had heard the news that the bastard of Ragnar was set to duel his instructor next week. Action, unimpressed, grabbed his glass of alcohol and threw it at the knight. The glass shattered against the knight's face, causing him to scream in pain before collapsing unconscious. Action Ragnar, one of the 4 hounds of the north, known as the Dark Tiger, furiously asked what it mattered if a so-called bastard ended up half-disabled. Next to Action, Remington Narcio, the Silver Lion, remained silent. At that moment, another person entered, warning Action that he should care. The 9 Dragons Sky Dragon, Ed Troyvan, cautioned Action that things might take a turn if they let their guard down. Action dismissed his uncle's concerns, insisting that only people with talent were worth worrying about. Remington respectfully bowed to Ed, while Action asked why Ed was concerned about Theo. Ed replied that when it came to the Ragnar clan, even the smallest possibility could lead to something unprecedented. He warned that a small flame in the wind could spark a wildfire at any moment. Action, however, reassured Ed that their instructor would handle the situation. A week later, at training ground number 4, the knights gathered to occupy the stage, with Evelyn and another important figure present to watch the duel. Theo stood on the stage, holding a real sword, quietly cursing under his breath. His initial goal had been to humiliate Rendon and get him fired. But things had spiraled out of control. The crowd cheered as both Theo and Rendon took the stage. Theo thought that, given how far things had escalated, he might as well seek revenge. At that moment, the system displayed his 3rd tutorial quest, Fight Rendon and Win. A week earlier, when Theo confronted Rendon by telling him his swordsmanship was trash, he also fired him on the spot, ordering him to get lost. Furious, Rendon called after him as Theo walked away, shouting that he couldn't accept the dismissal since there was still plenty of time left on his contract. but Theo simply asked what about the contract, and told Rendon that, as his employer, if he says he's fired, then he's fired. Though Theo wanted to beat Rendon to death considering their history in his past life, he wasn't confident enough in his skills yet. His plan was to separate from Rendon and dig up more information on him first. Rendon, on the other hand, knew that if he was fired like this, his mission would end in failure. He needed to convince Theo to let him stay. Desperate, Rendon ran after him, begging Theo to reconsider and warning that this went against the rules. As he did, the system appeared in front of Theo, showing his third tutorial quest. Meanwhile, Rendon threatened that if he reported the firing to the tribunal, things could get ugly for Theo. Suddenly, Evelyn appeared and suggested an alternative. She proposed resolving the issue the Ragnar way, which shocked both Rendon and Theo. Theo asked if she meant what he thought she did, and she confirmed, yes, they should settle it by a sword match, as per the rule of the strong. Evelyn added that there was no need to involve the tribunal, the victor of the duel would decide. Rendon, excited by the idea, eagerly agreed, thinking the heavens were on his side. Evelyn then declared that the duel would take place in 1 week, leaving Theo stunned. She smiled, asking if they agreed it was fair, but Theo, unable to speak out loud, could only think to himself that it was not alright. He glanced at Rendon, who confidently smirked at him, fully aware that Theo wasn't yet capable of defeating him. Back in the present, two knights chatted nearby. A black-haired knight mentioned hearing that Theo couldn't even swing his sword properly yet, to which a brown-haired knight responded in disbelief, asking if Theo wasn't still a Ragnar at the very least. The black-haired knight laughed and replied that Theo wasn't a normal Ragnar, he was the Ragnar cripple, and there was no way he could beat a mid-rank swordsman like Rendon. On the stage, Rendon smiled smugly at Theo, offering him a chance to back down. He said that if Theo apologized now, he would forget everything, and there was no need for Theo to risk his life over his pride. Theo, however, retorted that he should be the one saying that. He warned Rendon that if he didn't want to lose an arm, it would be best to accept that he was fired. Rendon was infuriated by Theo's audacity. He had considered letting Theo off because he pitied him, but now he decided to kill him, pretending it was an accident. In Rendon's mind, the outcome of the duel was already decided, and it would actually work out better for him this way. With a smirk, Rendon invited Theo to make the first move, stating that as his teacher, he would graciously concede the opening strike. Theo dashed forward, shouting that he wouldn't hesitate. Rendon positioned himself and blocked Theo's attack, the clash of their swords ringing loudly. Moments later, the audience of knights stood up in shock, murmuring in disbelief. They watched as Rendon attacked Theo with a series skillful slash. The crowd started shouting, jeering that they had expected this. Theo, the imbecile, was clearly losing. They ridiculed his inability to properly wield a sword, speculating that at this rate, Theo might actually die. Theo, blocking Rendon's attacks, mocked him, teasingly asking what had happened. He shouted at Theo, reminding him that he was a mid-rank swordsman, the very type Theo had looked down on, and taunted him for being so hopeless in the duel. Rendon thought the outcome was obvious. Theo wasn't even a low-rank swordsman, just an apprentice. While Theo's skills had strangely improved recently, it still wasn't enough. If Theo were at the level of the Four Hounds of the North, it might be a different story. But there was no way the imbecile of Ragnar could defeat him, Rendon was sure of that. Theo, however, remained calm. He recalled visiting Evelyn's office earlier to ask what she had been thinking when she suggested the duel. Evelyn had replied that she was helping him because, if Theo wanted to truly get rid of Rendon, he had to be thorough. She explained that Rendon likely had someone backing him, so simply firing him wouldn't solve the problem. Surprised, Theo asked how she knew, and Evelyn revealed that she had secretly investigated Rendon after noticing his odd teaching style. Weeks before, Evelyn had been observing Theo in the training ground when Rendon had shouted at him to angle his sword in a bizarre, exaggerated manner. Evelyn, suspicious of such a ridiculous instruction, had someone look into Rendon's background, which led her to believe there was more at play. She wondered to herself where this son of a bitch had come from, as it certainly wasn't the behavior of a competent swordsman. Theo realized that Evelyn hadn't uncovered this in his previous life, and he wondered if the recent incident with his Mana Hall had piqued her interest. Evelyn put down her tea and revealed that all of Rendon's traces led back to Camellia Palace, which shocked Theo. He seethed with anger, suspecting the conspiracy was tied to the miserable war for the throne. But he calmed down, admitting that it was impressive Evelyn had discovered so much. He also confessed that, despite everything, he wasn't yet strong enough to defeat Rendon. He asked what Evelyn intended to do now. Evelyn, however, told him that he was underestimating himself and that he could indeed beat Rendon. Back in the present, Rendon approached Theo with a mocking grin, shouting that if Theo knelt and begged for forgiveness now, he might spare him. Rendon swung his sword with great force, but to his surprise, Theo blocked the strike. Rendon felt a growing unease, something was off. Theo glared at him in anger and swung his sword, pushing Rendon's blade aside. Rendon realized, with mounting concern, that Theo had been fending off his attacks for a while now. This wasn't the Theo Ragnar he knew. Rendon, bewildered, swung his sword again, wondering how Theo's skills had improved so much in such a short time. But once again, Theo effortlessly pushed his blade away. The audience gasped in disbelief. Rendon was being pushed back by the very person they had all thought was hopeless. Among the spectators, Remington silently observed the unfolding duel. Evelyn smiled as she watched the scene, recalling her conversation with Theo. She had told him that if she trained him personally for just 1 week, he'd be able to suppress someone like Rendon easily. She had also remarked that Rendon, being a disgrace of a teacher, had no rights as an instructor. Theo had smiled at the time, amazed that things were working out in his favor. He knew that having Evelyn in his debt had been worthwhile. However, one thing still concerned him. Theo had asked Evelyn why she was going so far to help him. Was it because of what had happened last time? Evelyn admitted that was part of it, but also revealed that there was someone she knew, someone obsessed with collecting talent, who would likely take an interest in Theo. Rendon swung his sword backward, preparing to attack with great force, but Theo easily blocked the strike. Panic set in as Rendon struggled to understand how Theo, who had shown no talent from the beginning, could suddenly perform so well. Rendon began to wonder if Theo had been pretending to be weak all along. As Rendon pushed harder, trying to overpower him, he questioned why Theo had hidden his abilities. Theo then asked Rendon who was backing him, causing a wave of shock to wash over Rendon. In a fit of anger, Rendon swung his sword in a wide arc, furious and demanding an explanation for Theo's accusation. Theo, barely pushed by the attack, calmly mentioned that he had noticed the substandard lessons Rendon had been giving him. Rendon, feeling cornered, insisted that he had worked hard to help Theo, but Theo cut him off, suggesting that Camellia Palace might be involved. Rendon froze, momentarily speechless, wondering how Theo had uncovered this. Seeing Rendon's hesitation, Theo smiled, pleased that his assumption had hit the mark. Theo then leapt forward with intensity, questioning whether Rendon knew what it felt like to lose an arm. Before Rendon could react, Theo sliced through Rendon's arm in a single, decisive strike. Rendon watched in shock as his severed arm flew into the air. The spectators, including Remington, were stunned by what they had just witnessed. Rendon collapsed, screaming in pain as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. Despite the agony, Rendon angrily hurled insults at Theo. But Theo, growing more confident in his newfound strength, walked closer, reflecting on how far he had come. He thought back to the time when Rendon had blamed him for being weak and now considered how the tables had turned. Theo reminded Rendon of their previous encounter, pointing out that Rendon had once told him it was his fault that events had unfolded the way they had. Now, Theo coldly added that it was Rendon's fault he was dying here today. Memories of his own hopeless past flooded Theo's mind as he prepared for the final blow. Rendon, panicking, stammered and tried to plead, but Theo was resolute. In one swift motion, he beheaded Rendon, completing his revenge. The system immediately congratulated Theo on completing his third tutorial quest. The audience remained frozen in disbelief, while Evelyn, watching closely, felt a sense of pride. In the crowd, a mysterious figure observed, clearly satisfied with what had transpired. As Rendon's head fell to the ground, the system informed Theo that he had exceeded the quest's objective and had earned a bonus reward. It asked if he would like to claim it. Without hesitation, Theo accepted, wiping the blood from his face as he received his reward. The audience couldn't believe what they had witnessed. The so-called imbecile had won, despite being an apprentice swordsman up against a mid-tier swordsman. They murmured in disbelief, questioning how such a thing had happened. Theo, looking down at Rendon's lifeless body, thought back to his previous life and couldn't believe he had suffered at the hands of someone so weak. He knew, though, that things would be different from now on. The system then notified him that his ability, Observation, had been activated as a reward, along with an additional reward of 1 year's worth of magic power. He was amazed to receive a full year's magic power, but was curious about what exactly Observation was. Caught up in his thoughts, Theo didn't notice someone approaching from above. Suddenly, a figure landed on the stage with a deafening crash, shattering the floor beneath them and leaving Theo in shock. As the dust cleared, Theo looked back in horror to see none other than Julius Ragnar, the demon dragon and commander of the white-armored dragon cavalry. Panic flooded Theo's mind as he realized who Julius was and wondered how long he had been watching. The knights in the audience were equally stunned. They shouted in awe, recognizing Julius as one of the 9 dragons, the commander of the white-armored dragon cavalry. Meanwhile, Evelyn, more frustrated than surprised, muttered about how her commander had completely destroyed the floor and wished he could enter more normally. Theo, now face to face with one of the strongest men on the continent, felt his panic rise. As Julius approached, Theo froze in terror, especially when he saw the fierce glare in Julius's eyes. However, Julius suddenly broke into a loud, booming laugh, catching Theo off guard. With a soft pat on Theo's back, Julius complimented him, saying the duel had been exciting and impressive, confusing Theo even further. Julius continued, expressing his surprise at Theo's abilities. He asked if the student had truly surpassed the master, then realized it might be a bit disrespectful since Theo had killed Rendon. Still, Julius shrugged it off, remarking that a man like Rendon likely deserved it. Laughing, Julius dismissed the thought and, with enthusiasm, grabbed Theo by the shoulder, offering him a position in the white armored dragon cavalry. Theo was shocked by the offer, while Evelyn smiled knowingly from the sidelines. The knights were in disbelief. They couldn't fathom how the imbecile of Ragnar had been scouted into the elite white armored cavalry. Despite Theo's victory, they didn't think it warranted such an honor. Remington, standing nearby, turned to a fellow knight, asking if there had ever been a case where an apprentice swordsman, especially one who hadn't even undergone the awakening ceremony, had been scouted. After a moment's thought, the man replied that he had never heard of such a case. Remington agreed, certain it was unprecedented, as it was impossible to gauge someone's true potential while their mana hall remained closed. Even if their swordsmanship was excellent, they could lack magic power, which made it risky to recruit them. Remington couldn't understand how even someone like Julius could see such potential in Theo. To everyone's shock, Theo declined Julius's offer. He stared at Julius seriously, causing the commander to fall silent, speechless. Remington, Evelyn, and all the knights watching were equally confused, unable to comprehend why Theo had rejected such an opportunity. The entire training ground fell into stunned silence as they stared at the two figures on stage. In the days that followed, gossip about Theo Ragnar spread rapidly. People were stunned by the news that the so-called imbecile had killed his own master. Many concluded that Rendon must have been weak for such an event to happen. What shocked people even more was that Julius Ragnar, the demon dragon himself, had tried to recruit Theo into the white armored dragon cavalry after witnessing the duel, only for Theo to decline because he felt his skills weren't yet enough. Word quickly spread that Theo was a humble Ragnar, a rare quality that left many surprised. Meanwhile, at Camellia Palace, Emil Ragnar, the Lady of Camellia and Mother of Action, expressed her frustration, saying that things had become complicated and she couldn't believe Theo had killed Rendon. Ed, her brother, calmly reassured her, reminding her that Rendon had been assigned to Theo specifically because of his poor skills. Emil agreed, stating that the death of someone like Rendon wasn't important to them. However, her real concern was that Julius, the demon dragon, had personally reached out to Theo, and to make matters worse, Evelyn had apparently ordered it. This meant they could no longer interfere by assigning Theo a new master. Emil explained that if Theo started standing out, it would become much harder for them to take control of Rose Palace. At that moment, the door to her room opened, and Action entered, asking what she meant by standing out. He confidently told his mother not to worry, assuring her that the clan head wouldn't take an interest in Theo, so their plan could proceed as usual. Emil asked Action if he understood that the best way to take control of Rose Palace without offending the clan leader was for Theo to remain powerless. Action reassured her, saying that Theo was still powerless and that there was no way someone like him could have changed much. He also reminded them that Evelyn and Julius had always been drawn to underdogs. Ed, however, sternly cautioned Action not to make any rash decisions. Ignoring the warning, Action reached for the table and declared that, since his mother and uncle were so concerned, he'd play with Theo a little and remind him of his place. The next day at the training ground, after their session, Evelyn praised Theo for his progress. He thanked her, remarking on how much better it was to learn from a proper master like her. Evelyn responded that it would have been even better if he had joined the white armored dragon cavalry, and she asked him why he had declined the offer. Theo admitted to himself that he did have some regrets about turning down the cavalry, especially since it had been his dream in his past life. However, joining now would limit him too early. He thought about the privileges that would come to the top performer of the awakening ceremony, something that far surpassed joining the cavalry. He told Evelyn that he didn't want special privileges and still felt he wasn't ready, but he was satisfied with her training for the ceremony. Evelyn accepted his answer and mentioned that Commander Julius would likely be disappointed. Curious about Evelyn, Theo activated his observation ability. He saw that she was 24 years old, held the title of former deputy commander of the white armored dragon cavalry, and was a high-rank swordsman. Her current status showed that she admired his humility and character, felt energized from teaching him, and missed the cavalry. Theo smiled, realizing how useful his observation ability was, and he felt pleased to discover that Evelyn was genuinely happy to teach him. Suddenly, a young man approached, excusing himself and introducing himself respectfully as Sybil Drea from the Southern Inspection Post. He explained that he needed to discuss something with Theo. Confused, Theo noticed that Sybil looked intimidating, so he activated his observation skill again. The system revealed that Sybil Drea was 17 years old, held the title of Dunce of the Southern Inspection Post, and was also an apprentice swordsman. Sybil's rank was loyalty, and his status showed a strong admiration for Theo and a desire to spar with him, which left Theo shocked. He couldn't believe that someone with such a serious expression was eager to spar with him. At that moment, the system displayed that Theo's final tutorial quest had begun, to discard the title Imbecile of Ragnar with a completion goal of 100%. It also showed that he had already reached 28%. Sybil then admitted that he wished to follow Theo, acknowledging that he had ignored him in the past. He also believed the title Ragnar's Imbecile suited Theo perfectly, which made Theo angry as he instinctively lifted his sword. But before Theo could react further, Sybil sincerely explained that he had observed Theo coming out every morning to train harder than anyone else, and that the result of such effort was Theo's miraculous growth, something Sybil had seen firsthand. Recalling Theo's defeat of Rendon and his recruitment by the demon dragon, Julius Ragnar, Sybil declared that Theo had become his idol. Sybil confessed that, after being called the idiot of the Southern Inspection Post, he had nearly given up on himself, but seeing Theo gave him hope. Bowing deeply, with his sword raised above his head, Sybil begged Theo for the opportunity to clash swords with him. Normally, Theo would have doubted Sybil's true intentions, but after using his observation ability, he confirmed that Sybil was genuine. This was unexpected, but Theo realized that after taking down Rendon and the rumors of Julius's attention spreading, people driven by an inferiority complex would likely challenge him. What he didn't expect, however, was that some would actually want to follow him instead. He guessed that, at the very least, the pride of the Ragnar bloodline still held sway among people like Sybil. Theo understood that, eventually, he would need followers of his own if he were to become the head of the Ragnar clan. His fourth and final tutorial quest, Discard the Title Imbecile of Ragnar, was directly tied to this. Theo knew this was a title he had never been able to shake in his previous life, but this time, with new opportunities, he was determined to completely rid himself of it. Turning to Evelyn, Theo asked if they could have a moment. Evelyn, with a proud smile, agreed and encouraged him to show off his skills. Raising his sword, Theo formally introduced himself as Theo Ragnar, apprentice swordsman of Rose Palace, awaiting the awakening ceremony, and proudly named Evelyn Nereval as his master. Evelyn beamed at this. In response, Sybil introduced himself as Sybil Drea, apprentice swordsman of the Southern Inspection Post, and a practitioner of the Cure clan's swordsmanship, specializing in the quicksword. After the formal introductions, Theo suggested they have a good spar. Sybil immediately sprang forward, launching his sword at Theo. Theo easily blocked the attack, and Sybil noted how fast Theo was. Despite being known as the idiot of the Southern Inspection Post, Sybil was still confident in his speed. Sybil continued to swing at Theo, recognizing that his opponent's skills were indeed the real deal. Theo, blocking each of Sybil's slashes with ease, thought back to how, in his previous life, he would have struggled to fend off even a few strikes. With a powerful swing, Theo raised his sword and sent Sybil flying, effortlessly overpowering him. Sybil spat out in pain as he slammed into the floor, but instead of frustration, he smiled happily. Sybil praised Theo, acknowledging that he had lost to his young master, and thanked him for the opportunity, saying he had learned a lot from the spar. Theo raised his sword again, signaling that the duel was over, and told Sybil it was a good fight. Theo noticed his reflection in his shining sword and wondered if he could use his observation skill on himself. Curiosity piqued, he activated the skill. To his surprise, it worked, displaying a screen that read observing, Theo Ragnar. He was taken aback by the details it showed. His title was still Imbecile of Ragnar, and his talents included Player, Ragnar, Observation, and 4 locked talents labeled as Denied Access. His status indicated a strong yearning for the awakening ceremony. His level was 1, with the following stats: Strength 13, Dexterity 14, Vitality 12, Magic Power 190, Intelligence 11, and Luck -49. The system popped up, explaining that his stats were now perceivable, and all stats would be represented by numbers going forward. Theo noted his talents being categorized, and he wondered if completing more quests would unlock the 4 hidden abilities. He was pleased to see that he could personally check his stat values, especially noticing that his magic power was high, thanks to his past life's magic and the dragon heart. However, the negative luck stat puzzled him. He wondered if it meant he had been cursed and if all the bad luck from his previous life had stemmed from this. Deactivating his observation skill, Theo thought to himself that he needed to find a way to increase his luck. Just then, he heard people approaching from behind and turned to see several men watching him. Evelyn observed that although Rendon had been weak, he was still a mid-rank swordsman, and the fact that Theo had defeated him and received the approval of Julius meant that in Ragnar's rule of the strong society, people would either envy him or admire him. The group gathered behind Theo seemed to fall into the latter category. The knights had been shocked by Theo and Sybil's duel, confirming that the rumors were true. They wondered if they themselves could have blocked Theo's strikes had they been in Sybil's place. Among them, Aud-Nalan, wanting to spar with Theo but unsure how to ask, stood silently. Theo used his observation ability on him and learned that Aud-Nalan was 19 years old, held the title pillar of the Nalan Viscount, and was a low-rank swordsman. His talent was passion and perseverance, and his current status revealed a strong desire to spar with Theo. With a sigh, Theo called out to Aud, surprising him. Aud stammered, asking if Theo knew him, but Theo simply ordered him to come forward and suggested they spar. Aud, excited, raised his sword and eagerly replied that it would be an honor. He introduced himself as the third son of Viscount Nalan, trained in the swordsmanship style known as Double Ascension. Theo introduced himself in return as Theo Ragnar of Rose Palace, expressing hope that they would have a good fight. Both rushed at each other, their swords clashing in the middle, causing Theo's basic swordsmanship proficiency to increase. Aud quickly pulled his sword back, gaining momentum, and swung it forcefully toward Theo's side, nearly landing a strike on his neck. However, Theo blocked it just in time, pushing Aud's sword away, and his changing heart swordsmanship proficiency increased as well. Aud, stunned by Theo's skill, admitted defeat, stammering as he acknowledged his loss. The system informed Theo that he had gained Aud-Nalan's approval, and his luck increased by 1 point. This left Theo wondering if gaining people's approval could improve his luck and if it also tracked his reputation. Additionally, the system showed that he had earned experience points. Theo slashed his sword forward, engaging with the next knight who wanted to fight him. Knowing he needed to keep pushing himself, he continued to defeat his opponents, one by one. After each victory, he earned their approval. Bennett Ramiro's approval increased his luck by 1, followed by Eric Morin, who also granted him an additional point of luck. He continued to battle, gaining the approval of Manfred Monbert, Manuel Noir, Viro Perink, and Daniel Raman, each victory adding another point to his luck. After defeating several knights, Theo took a moment to catch his breath. He asked who would be next, but when no one stepped forward, he opened his status window. Despite having fought so many, his quest progress had only increased by 1%. Confused, he wondered if it was because these knights already respected him to some extent. He began to suspect that in order to make significant progress, he needed to challenge stronger foes or prove himself in front of those who still looked down on him. A different kind of event was required. Suddenly, a voice from behind remarked on how exhausted he seemed and asked if he would be alright. Theo responded that he'd rest when necessary, but for now, he didn't need it. The man stepped forward, revealing himself as Remington Narcio, one of the 4 Hounds of the North, who then requested a spar with Theo. Theo was shocked. Remington was a member of the prestigious 4 Hounds of the North, which included Hulkus Lank, Ray Ragnar, Action Ragnar of Camellia Palace, and Remington himself. These were the strongest warriors of the Ragnar clan's awakening ceremony generation. Remington introduced himself and explained that he had come early to see Theo's swordsmanship before the awakening ceremony. Curious, Theo activated his observation skill and saw that Remington was 17 years old, held the title of Deputy Clan Head of Narcio, and was also known as the Silver Lion, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. His talents were listed as Sword Genius, Keen Senses, and Extremely Hard Worker. His current status revealed that he was surprised to see a rival he hadn't expected. Raising his sword, Remington thanked Theo for fulfilling his wish, expressing his desire to test his skills. Theo raised his own sword and introduced himself as the 31st son of the Great Guardian of the North, Kyle Ragnar, and an apprentice swordsman preparing for the awakening ceremony. Smiling, Theo felt honored. He never imagined he would meet and fight the legendary sword genius Remington, someone he had admired for a long time. While his quest was still ongoing, the thrill of fighting Remington was all that mattered to him at that moment. Theo humbly told Remington that it was an honor to cross swords with the famed Deputy Clan Head of Narcio. Remington, in turn, expressed his excitement for the upcoming battle. As they both took their stances, Theo wondered if his current abilities were enough to defeat someone as formidable as Remington, one of the 4 Hounds of the North. Their swords clashed, sending a loud metallic sound reverberating through the area. As their battle began, the system showed that Theo's tutorial quest progress had increased by 1%. Due to the strong clash of their swords, one of them shattered into pieces, completely destroyed. Evelyn observed calmly, but the knights were stunned. Half of the broken sword fell to the ground. It was Theo's. The spectators couldn't believe that their young master had seemingly lost. Sybil, in disbelief, shouted that it couldn't be true. but Manuel pointed out that it was an obvious result. No matter how much Theo had grown, it was impossible for him to defeat one of the 4 hounds, the strongest warriors of their generation. Still, Sybil praised Theo's fighting spirit. The knights were even more surprised when Remington admitted that it was his loss. He thanked Theo for the good duel, explaining that his sword had already been worn out and he was exhausted, which meant the duel was his defeat. However, Theo responded that, on a battlefield, no one would offer such considerations, and admitted that he had lost the moment he lost his sword. Remington smiled at Theo and they shook hands. Remington expressed his hope for a proper duel next time, and Theo agreed, hoping for the same. Manuel was shocked to see that Theo had been acknowledged by one of the 4 hounds, while Sybil proudly shouted to Manuel that their young master, Theo, was different. Evelyn sighed in relief, and the system informed Theo that his quest progress had increased to 35%. Theo looked at Remington, acknowledging his strength. He understood that while he had gained incredible power from talents and secret manuals through the system, Remington's skill was still far beyond his. The moment their swords clashed, Theo realized that he still had much to improve. Though disappointed that the duel ended prematurely, Theo felt he had gained a lot. Not only had his luck increased by 10 points, but his reputation had also improved significantly. However, he was still dissatisfied with his quest progress, which hadn't moved as much as he'd hoped. He began thinking about what stage or event might help him gain more approval. Remington then called out to him, explaining that he hadn't come just to duel. Handing Theo an envelope, Remington invited him to join the Scaled Dragon Society. Sybil was shocked, knowing that the Scaled Dragon Society was a prestigious group, exclusive to those who had been specially selected. He couldn't believe that Remington had personally invited Theo. Theo, equally surprised, questioned whether someone like him was suited to join such a famous group. Remington dismissed Theo's doubts, saying that he was more than qualified. He explained that the Scaled Dragon Society wasn't as serious as it sounded. It was simply a social group for peers preparing for the upcoming awakening ceremony. Curious, Sybil asked why Theo was being invited, while Bennett, overwhelmed, looked ready to cry. Theo wasn't sure of Remington's motives for the invitation, but he knew that the Scaled Dragon Society was centered around action and filled with people who looked down on him. He realized this would be the perfect environment to progress his quest and gather information on action and Camellia Palace. There was no reason to refuse. Accepting the invitation, Theo thanked Remington and confirmed that he would participate. The knights were amazed that Theo had been invited to the Scaled Dragon Society, and the system informed him that his quest progress had increased by 1%. Remington shook Theo's hand, pleased with his decision, and told him that if he had any questions, he shouldn't hesitate to ask. Remington then mentioned that the next meeting would be in 2 weeks. Evelyn, lighting her cigar, watched them silently, deep in thought. A moment later, at Rose Palace, Cecilia barged into Theo's room, calling out to him. Surprised, he told her he was just about to deliver some news, but he was left speechless when several maids followed her inside. Stammering, he asked his mother what was going on. Cecilia excitedly explained that she had heard about his invitation to the Scaled Dragon Society. She went on to explain that the society included Action, the son of the cunning Amel, as well as brilliant talents like Remington. The maids began assessing which colors suited him best, while Cecilia explained that the Scaled Dragon Society garnered attention from the council. Everything about him, from how he dressed to how he composed himself, would be scrutinized. As Cecilia measured his shoulders, she reassured him that while his etiquette would be flawless, his attire and demeanor were matters she could help with. She reminded him that she used to be an actress, so this was something she knew well, and she was more than happy to assist him. Theo knew he was often labeled the illegitimate child of a commoner concubine, and his mother had always felt guilty about it, even though it wasn't her fault. In the cold Ragnar clan, he could only imagine how hard it must have been for her, especially with a son who was often seen as lacking. Cecilia then hugged him tightly, calling him her son, and told him she believed in him, that she knew he could succeed. Theo smiled, touched by her words, and hugged her back, assuring her that there was no need to worry anymore. The room was filled with emotion, and everyone present was moved by the moment. Cecilia, with pride, declared that her son was joining the Scaled Dragon Society. 2 weeks later, on the night of the Scaled Dragon Society banquet, Remington stood outside Rose Palace, waiting. He was taken aback when Theo walked out, dressed impeccably, with Cecilia and the servants wishing him good luck. Theo smiled at Remington, but Remington, still in awe, asked if it was really him, commenting on how different he looked. Theo laughed, telling Remington to stop teasing, but Remington insisted he was being genuine and pointed toward the carriage. As they got into the carriage, Theo reflected on Remington's words. He did feel different. He had grown taller, his muscles had become more defined, and 2 weeks of diligent training had clearly paid off. During that time, Remington had visited him daily and they had grown closer. Not to mention, Theo had also gained new followers. Evelyn had sighed many times during the 2 weeks, saying she only intended to teach him for a short while but somehow got pulled into a more involved process. Theo, in turn, simply looked away, knowing how exhausting the past weeks had been, especially with Remington's daily presence, which made Evelyn hit her head in frustration more than once. As the carriage rattled along, Remington asked if this would be Theo's first formal banquet, to which Theo replied it was. Remington reassured him, saying there was no need to be nervous, he knew Theo would do well. However, he also warned Theo about his friend, Action, which left Theo confused. Remington explained that Action could be very mischievous, but in fact, it was Action who had extended the invitation, not Remington. Action had expressed a desire to meet Theo and had gone so far as to prepare the banquet in his honor. Remington hoped Theo wouldn't think too harshly of Action. Theo, now understanding that it was Action who had invited him, smiled, thinking it was all going a bit too well. He replied that he was looking forward to it, fully expecting the evening to come with its share of insults and challenges. Meanwhile, at Camellia Palace, Action held a glass of alcohol, excitedly anticipating the arrival of what he saw as a new toy, Theo, the imbecile of Ragnar. A moment later, the carriage stopped, and the driver informed them that they had arrived. Remington stepped down first, followed by Theo, who looked up to see they had reached Camellia Palace, the place that had once instigated Rendon to interfere with his growth and ultimately consumed his mother and the entirety of Rose Palace. Remington asked if they should head inside, and Theo responded affirmatively. As they walked, Remington mentioned that Action would personally greet him at the entrance, a rare gesture. However, Theo's mind was elsewhere. He knew Action was likely trying to halt his rise, but Theo had come prepared, determined to make Action realize who he was really dealing with. Suddenly, a blue light reflected off his earrings. When he looked up, Theo noticed the glow of the quest in one of the rooms, making him wonder if there was a quest hidden within Camellia Palace. Before he could investigate further, Remington called out his name in alarm, rushing toward him as something fell from above. A loud explosion followed, leaving a cloud of dust. Shocked, Remington called out again, but Theo emerged from the dust, replying that he was fine. It had only been a sack of flour. Remington, furious, looked up and demanded to know what the culprits were doing. Theo brushed the flour off his clothes, knowing that in his past life, he wouldn't have been able to dodge and would have been covered in the powder. He glanced at Remington, suspecting for a moment that he might have been in on the prank. But after checking Remington's status using observation, Theo saw genuine confusion and realized Remington had no part in it. Looking up, Theo knew the flower stunt had been Action's doing. Sure enough, Action appeared and asked what Theo thought of his greeting, claiming it was simply a friendly welcome, basic courtesy between peers. Remington angrily demanded an explanation, but Action brushed it off, asking if Remington was actually upset and suggesting he should just take it as a playful greeting between brothers. Theo activated his observation skill on Action and saw that Action held the title Dark Tiger and was an apprentice swordsman. His talents included madness, psychopath, and overwhelming swordsmanship talent, and his current status showed he was excited, viewing Theo as a new toy to play with. Smiling, Theo thanked Action, which surprised him. When Action asked what he meant by that, Theo brightly explained that Action's warm welcome naturally made him feel grateful, and he was looking forward to the party. Action, taken aback at first, quickly recovered and commented that it had been a while since he had so much fun. A moment later, they entered the grand party room, where murmurs and whispers filled the air. The guests were confused about Action's intentions. Many questioned why someone from the direct line, like Action, would invite Theo, the so-called imbecile, to the prestigious Scaled Dragon Society. Yet, as they observed Theo, they admitted he seemed more composed than expected. Theo walked through the room with Remington, sipping wine, while the other guests continued whispering, wondering if Action was planning to toy with Theo again. Remington, feeling embarrassed, apologized to Theo once more, explaining that they usually weren't this hostile. Theo reassured him, saying he was fine and, in fact, was even grateful for the attention, leaving Remington confused. Theo internally smiled, thinking that all the gossip and insults were necessary. He needed them to talk behind his back, because the more they did, the sweeter his victory would be when he crushed them later. As Theo continued scanning the room, he noticed that the source of the blue light, the quest marker he had seen from outside, was located on the second floor. He was certain it was linked to a quest, but for now, he had no natural way to approach it without drawing attention. Theo sipped his wine, deep in thought, but was soon interrupted by Action, who came down asking if he was enjoying the party. Theo reminded himself to stay calm and follow through with his plan. Smiling, he responded that he was indeed enjoying it and thanked Action for the invitation. Action, feigning apology, admitted that he might have gone overboard earlier. Placing a hand on Theo's shoulder, Action creepily asked if Theo would accept his apology. Before Theo could respond, Remington angrily called out to Action, But instead of addressing Remington's anger, Theo surprised everyone by saying there was no need for an apology. He only remembered a friendly greeting. Action, taken aback for a moment, laughed and slapped Theo on the back, declaring how fun Theo had become and that he had no idea Theo was like this. Action added, loud enough for the guests to hear, that Theo had changed a lot from how he used to be, and he liked him more and more. The guests laughed, teasing that Theo was just smiling and acting like Action's lapdog. One man commented that an illegitimate child like Theo, with no real roots, could never stand up to the noble blood of the Troyven family. Another guest agreed, saying that despite both being Ragnars, Theo and Action were on completely different levels. How could someone like Theo, born of a random woman, ever compare to the noble swordsmanship lineage of the Troyven clan? Despite hearing all the whispers, Theo remained calm, smiling outwardly while holding back his anger. The guests then shifted their gossip to Remington, wondering why he was so close to Theo. One of them remarked that if they looked into it, Remington was also illegitimate. This shocked Remington and left the room in an uncomfortable silence. The man who had spoken suddenly realized he had crossed a line, as Remington's illegitimacy was a forbidden topic. Theo, sensing the sadness from Remington and growing more furious, decided to act. Calling out to Action, Theo asked if he should introduce himself to his new friends. He walked over to the table, grabbed a bottle of wine, and approached the man who had insulted Remington. The man, sensing something was off, stuttered, asking if he had said something wrong. Without warning, Theo swung the bottle and smashed it over the man's head, stunning both Action and Remington. The man screamed in pain, clutching his bleeding head, calling Theo a bastard. But Theo responded with a swift kick to the man's head, knocking him to the ground. Calmly, Theo asked what the man meant by bastard and remarked that he had merely given him a friendly greeting. Using bastard was such a hurtful thing to say. The other guests panicked, whispering in disbelief and questioning whether Theo was truly the imbecile they had assumed. As this unfolded, Theo's tutorial quest progress jumped to 43%. Remington, shocked, realized this wasn't the Theo he knew and wondered if Theo was acting for his sake. Meanwhile, Theo stood over the fallen man and, with a cold smile, stated that he had extended his welcome. Stepping on the man's arm, he asked if it was time for the man to say his goodbyes, gripping his arm tightly. The man pleaded for Theo to wait, but with a swift motion, Theo snapped the man's arm, the bone breaking audibly. Everyone in the room stood frozen in shock and disbelief as Theo's quest progress surged to 59%. As the man collapsed in agony, Theo released his grip and casually asked if anyone else wanted to say hello. His quest progress increased again, now reaching 66%. At that moment, guards emerged from hiding, surrounding Theo and drawing their swords, aiming them at his head. They shouted that harming their young master would be paid for with death. Theo wasn't surprised. He knew the man he had just beaten was Ian Hanabi, the third young master of the Hanabi clan, one of the 6 snow clans that supported Ragnar. But this was exactly why he had come to the Scaled Dragon Society, knowing it was filled with enemies. Theo addressed the guards calmly, telling them that he knew the Hanabi clan's position, and he expected that they wouldn't stand idly by while the imbecile they had always looked down on suddenly started fighting back. But he no longer planned to tolerate their disrespect. Theo then asked the guards, so what if Ian is the young master of the Hanabi clan? His words left the knight stunned. He followed up with a sharp question, asking if the dogs of a Ragnar Bannerman clan dared to demand his death and if they were prepared to take responsibility for such words. The knights stood frozen in fear, wondering what kind of pressure they were feeling and if this could really be the imbecile of Ragnar they thought they knew. One of the knights suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. Theo, as a direct descendant of Ragnar, held the right of succession. Ragnar was the Lord of the North, ruling over the 6 snow clans. Declaring death upon a bloodline of the Dragon Lord was a sin so severe that the destruction of an entire clan wouldn't even be considered unreasonable. The knight understood that while this hadn't applied to Theo for a long time, it did now, and they would need to apologize immediately. But before they could act, Theo gave an order to kill them. A sword flashed through the air, swiftly decapitating the knights who had aimed their blades at Theo. He stood calmly, staring as the bodies collapsed to the ground. The guests, Remington, and even Action were shocked by the sudden violence, while Theo's quest progress jumped to 70%. At that moment, Evelyn appeared, asking Theo when he realized she had been following him. He replied simply that it was obvious. Though he hadn't known why she was following, Theo felt relief, knowing she was there allowed him to turn the tables without hesitation. As they exchanged glances, the room fell into a tense silence. The night before, in a quiet room, Julius poured himself a glass of wine and reminded Evelyn that she had once said she wouldn't take on any more disciples. He asked if her new swordsmanship disciple, Theo, was to her liking. Evelyn, not indulging in small talk, asked if Julius didn't have someplace else to be, reminding him that he only ever stayed close before her retirement. Laughing, Julius admitted that tormenting her had become his latest joy, and again pressed her for an answer about Theo. Evelyn sighed, pointing out that the wine Julius was drinking was expensive. Julius drank it anyway and pressed her once more for an answer. Finally, Evelyn admitted that Theo had far exceeded her expectations. Considering both his attitude and talent, she stated that he was the best student she had ever taught. Julius, curious, reminded her that action had once passed through her hands as well and asked if she still considered Theo to be better. Evelyn confirmed this, explaining that Theo's potential was far beyond even actions. She assured Julius that these were not empty words. Julius chuckled, noting that Evelyn's sharp eyes gave her an advantage in seeing such things. He then asked if Theo had been hiding his strength all this time, since it was impossible for someone to change so drastically overnight. Evelyn agreed, saying it seemed Theo had been concealing his abilities, but she found it strange that someone who had kept their strength hidden for so long would suddenly start flaunting it. She added that being too hasty often led to mistakes, and it felt as though Theo was being chased by something. That, she said, was why she was concerned about his attendance at the Scaled Dragon Society. Julius, seeing her worry, suggested it was likely because of action and advised her to follow Theo if she was so concerned. Confused, Evelyn asked what he meant. Julius explained that when wolf cubs searching for blood gather, they tend to solidify their hierarchy. Something was bound to happen. He then added, with a sly grin, that while she was there, she might as well tempt Theo into joining the white-armored dragon cavalry. Julius placed a cavalry uniform on her table, leaving her momentarily stunned. As he walked toward the door, he suggested that both she and Theo join the cavalry together. Smiling, Julius teased her, saying she couldn't retire just because he couldn't ride a dragon, and that she should take responsibility for the one she had introduced. Waving goodbye, Julius commented that the wine had been excellent, leaving Evelyn speechless. She glanced at the uniform and quietly remarked that, of course, it tasted good, it was expensive. Back at Camellia Palace, Evelyn watched Theo and realized he had orchestrated the entire situation on purpose, having known she was following him all along. It dawned on her that perhaps Theo had joined the Scaled Dragon Society with this exact plan in mind. He wasn't someone she needed to worry about after all. She wondered when exactly he had noticed her presence, confirming to herself that he was far from ordinary. Theo, in fact, had sensed Evelyn's presence the moment he entered the carriage. His dragon heart allowed him to unleash his energy perception, often referred to as a sixth sense. He was thankful for it, knowing the stage had been set and that the final step of his plan was about to unfold. He turned to Evelyn and called out to her, stating that most of the people present had shown disrespect to a successor candidate. Calmly, he asked her what the punishment was for such a crime. His question shocked and horrified the guests. Evelyn replied that, according to clan law, immediate execution was possible. Smiling at her answer, Theo said that since the offenders were all children who hadn't even undergone their awakening ceremony, she should take only one of their arms and leave it at that. Without hesitation, Evelyn dashes at the guests, replying that she understood. Panic spread among the nobles as they stutteringly begged her to wait, but it was too late. She swiftly cut off the arm of the first noble in her path, announcing that she was done with the second son of the Byron clan. One by one, she moved through the room, cutting off the arms of the first son of the Red and White Mercenary Corps, the fourth daughter of the Ceres Merchant Guild, the third son of the Clark clan, and the first daughter of the Howard clan. With each strike, Theo's tutorial quest progress increased, first to 72%, then to 76%, and finally to 79%. One of the nobles grabbed Action's pants, begging him to intervene. But Action merely stared down at him, asking why he should help when it was just a greeting. The man stuttered in disbelief, trying to process Action's response, but before he could react further, Evelyn slashed his arm, leaving him writhing on the floor in pain. Evelyn announced that she had dealt with the first son of the Parank family. Action and Evelyn locked eyes, and Action remarked that he hadn't expected to meet her again under these circumstances. Evelyn respectfully raised her sword to her head and acknowledged it had been a while. Theo's quest progress jumped to 82%. Action realized that Evelyn had only targeted those who had insulted Theo's bloodline, leaving him unable to interfere even as a fellow successor candidate. He watched as Evelyn approached Theo, reporting that she had cut the right arms of the 14 individuals he had ordered her to. Remington also approached, and Theo praised Evelyn for her work and asking about the status of the wounded. Evelyn calmly replied that if they took the severed arms to a priest quickly, they could be reattached, but their futures as swordsmen were in doubt. Theo responded that it was perfect. Remington, concerned, asked Theo if he was alright. Action, observing the situation, realized both Remington and Evelyn had become captivated by Theo. Laughing to himself, Action confirmed that the imbecile of Rose Palace had truly changed. However, he couldn't suppress the growing rage inside him, wanting nothing more than to crush Theo beneath his feet. As Theo turned to leave, he calmly told Evelyn and Remington that it was time to go. Evelyn immediately agreed, and Remington, stuttering, said he would follow as well. When Theo passed Action, he lightly tapped him on the arm and smiled, remarking that he had enjoyed the evening. This Action completed his 4th tutorial quest. As he walked away, he told Action that they would see each other again soon, leaving Action fuming with anger. The system congratulated Theo for completing his final tutorial quest in the presence of Evelyn Naravel. Action, furious, called out Theo's name loudly, but the system showed that all tutorial quests had been completed. No one would call him the imbecile of Ragnar anymore. Proudly, Theo walked out of Camellia Palace, knowing that while the quest was complete, his true revenge had only just begun. As a reward, he received an experience elixir, a potion capable of leveling him up 5 times, though it could only be used below level 30. Later, back at Camellia Palace, Amel was in her office, working on paperwork, when a man reported the events of the evening to her. In shock, she ordered him to repeat the information. As the man confirmed the chaos at Action's Scaled Dragon Society, Amel and Ed were left speechless. Meanwhile, at the Rose Palace Inn, Sybil lifted his glass of alcohol high, shouting that they were celebrating their young master Theo's unbelievable high society debut. The others cheered, clinking their glasses together in excitement as they partied around Theo, making him feel a sense of relief. He drank his beer in victory, surrounded by people he could finally call his own. That same night at Camellia Palace, a loud slap echoed from one of the rooms, reverberating down the hallway. Inside, Amel furiously confronted Action, scolding him for giving Theo, the imbecile bastard, justification to act and for allowing his people's arms to be chopped off. Action simply replied, yes, which only fueled Amel's rage. She shouted, asking if he really believed any of it made sense and reminded him how many times she had warned him not to take Theo lightly. She then ordered Action to forget any plans of pressuring Theo into submission, pointing out that he had just given Theo the grounds to go wild. Amel stressed once more that she had warned him repeatedly. Once Theo Ragnar began to stand out, it would become far more difficult to take control of Rose Palace. Action tried to reassure his mother that she needn't worry, but she cut him off, shouting that she didn't want to hear it. She ordered him to reflect on his actions, accusing him of almost ruining their grand plan just for the sake of shallow enjoyment. Action reluctantly replied that he would keep it in mind before leaving the room. As Action exited, Amel furiously asked, "Who does he take after to be so impulsive?" A voice from the shadows replied, "He takes after you when you were young." Startled, Amel asked if that was meant as a joke. Ed, her brother, stepped forward from the darkness and told her not to be so angry, suggesting that the incident might not be as bad as she thought. Curious, Amel asked why. Ed explained that since Rose Palace had always been part of the clan head's harem, it was difficult to seize ownership. While it had been largely ignored by the clan head as a place where riffraff gathered, it still had his backing. To take control, they needed justification. Ed went on to say that, fortunately, Theo had created significant chaos at the Scaled Dragon Society meeting, and as he slowly became the representative of Rose Palace, they could use the incident as justification. This surprised Amel. Amel had been unsettled by Theo's growing strength, fearing that it might attract more attention from the clan head, making their influence over Rose Palace harder to solidify. But Ed suggested they could now use Theo's rise to their advantage. By using legal procedures under the pretense of discipline, they could quietly suppress Theo and his growing influence, leaving Rose Palace with no choice but to submit to the Troivans, thus taking over without causing a stir. Amel, closing her fan with excitement, asked Ed how long it would take to prepare everything. Ed smiled and told her preparations were already complete. He assured her that by the time she woke up in the morning, she would hear uplifting news. With that, he encouraged her to enjoy a bath and get a good night's sleep. Handing her an aromatic candle, he added that he had gone to great lengths to acquire it from the volcanic regions of South Arkan. Amel embraced Ed, telling him that she expected nothing less from her elder brother and that it was why she couldn't help but love him. Meanwhile, back at the Rose Palace Inn, Remington approached Theo, clearly shocked. He confessed that he hadn't realized Theo cared so much. Confused, Theo asked what he meant. Remington explained that he was referring to what had happened at the Scaled Dragon Society, but Theo just wondered if Remington was drunk despite only drinking orange juice. Remington continued, saying that while Theo had endured the insults aimed at himself, the moment people began insulting Remington, Theo didn't hesitate to step in and defend him. Remington admitted that he had been unable to act and felt embarrassed for not doing anything himself. Looking at Theo, Remington found himself increasingly surprised by the person Theo had become. He reflected on how Theo had endured being looked down upon for so long, seen by many as an untalented, illegitimate child. Yet despite all that, Theo had emerged stronger. Remington also remembered that Theo had faced opponents even when the odds were against him, wielding his sword without hesitation and standing firm in battles where his strength alone wasn't enough. In those moments, Remington realized Theo possessed both the willpower and courage to fight for others, not just himself. Remington's status showed that he was deeply touched, believing that Theo genuinely cared for him. Theo, however, quickly realized that Remington had greatly misunderstood something. Remington recalled his clan's orders to build friendly ties with Action, but his heart was set on something else. Suddenly, Remington stood up and, with a determined voice, declared that he wished to follow Theo from now on. The room erupted in cheers, with everyone shouting that, as expected, the strong recognize the strong. Theo, caught off guard, tried to explain the misunderstanding, calling out to Remington to wait. He started to say that Remington had misunderstood something. But before he could finish, he heard Evelyn's voice in his head, telling him to just let Remington be. Stunned, Theo wondered if it was telepathy. He turned around to see Evelyn smiling at him. Using telepathy, she explained that it wasn't a bad misunderstanding and that, perhaps, everyone just wanted to get along with him. Surprised, Theo sighed, thinking that he wasn't anyone special. He mused that all of this, the regression, the power of Ragnar's talent, and his newfound strength might be due to the mysterious message window. Theo then pondered the nature of the system. Initially, he thought it was merely fragments of his regret, but its detail made him reconsider. He felt a vague sense of déjà vu, but whatever it was helping him, and so he concluded it didn't matter. He also noticed that, since the Scaled Dragon Society incident, his level had increased. He realized that leveling up granted him points to distribute across his stats, allowing him to increase his abilities as he wished. It felt both exhilarating and frightening, making him smile in a way that Evelyn found unsettling, confused by his expression. Realizing the need to prepare for the inevitable counterattack from Camellia Palace, Theo decided to act. He called Remington Remy and asked if he would help with something since he had already mentioned it. Remington, thrilled by the friendly nickname, immediately agreed, telling Theo to ask him anything. Excited, Remington noted how Theo had called him Remy in such a friendly manner. Theo lifted a piece of paper and told him that the war for the throne between him and Action would intensify soon, and they needed to prepare. He asked Remington to assist him, which left Remington momentarily shocked. Theo knew that in the future, Remington would become the clan head of the Narcio clan, a force powerful enough to confront the Ragnars. This was an opportunity to completely bring Remington to his side. Handing the paper to Remington, Theo hoped he would accept. Fortunately, Remington took the paper and, with conviction, pledged to follow Theo. He promised to help with whatever Theo needed. Theo smiled, thanked him, and acknowledged his loyalty. Just as Remington was about to remind Theo again of the friendly nickname, a voice shouted from outside. The inn door burst open, and a higher-ranking knight, one of the Swords of Law, walked in, shocking everyone. The knight, stern-faced, held up a warrant and declared that Theo was under arrest for threats, assault, and intimidation, leaving the room in stunned silence. Evelyn, outraged, shouted in disbelief, asking what kind of nonsense this was. Theo, remaining calm, stood up, reassuring everyone that it was all right and urged them to stay calm. He looked at the warrant from the knight, confirming its legitimacy, but noted that the ink hadn't even dried yet. It was clear they were in a rush. Voluntarily, Theo extended his hands and told the knights they should proceed. The captain of the Swords of Law placed handcuffs on Theo, and he followed them out of the inn. As Theo was led away, everyone in the inn called out to him in worry, but he looked back with a calm smile, which shocked both Remington and Evelyn. As he disappeared from view, Remington glanced down at the piece of paper Theo had left behind, his mind racing with uncertainty. The next day, at Rose Palace, Cecilia was in shock upon hearing the news. She shouted at the butler, asking if it was true that Theo had been taken to the tribunal. Overcome, she fell to her knees, causing the butler to rush to her side in worry. Cecilia reassured him that she was all right and asked what charges Theo was facing. The butler replied that it seemed to be related to the Scaled Dragon Society, and the accusation was inciting rebellion. Cecilia, even more shocked, struggled to comprehend the severity of the situation. The butler asked if she believed the case would go to trial. Cecilia, after a moment of thought, said she was sure it would. The butler added that since Theo had completely dismantled the Scaled Dragon Society, it wouldn't end easily. Cecilia, filled with concern, wondered who could have predicted that Theo's invitation to the Scaled Dragon Society would lead to such consequences. But then she stopped, reassuring herself that Theo would get through this. He was always that kind of child. She wished desperately for her son's safe return. Meanwhile, in the silence of the carriage, Theo was deep in thought, escorted by the Swords of Law. He opened his eyes and gazed out the window, seeing that they had arrived at the gate of the tribunal. It had been a long time since he had been there. He understood that after destroying the Scaled Dragon Society, this wouldn't end with simple imprisonment. A trial was inevitable. He also knew that being brought before the tribunal meant they intended to challenge his qualifications as Ragnar's successor. When they reached the tribunal door, the knight ordered Theo to get off. He quietly complied, thinking that they probably wanted to crush him completely this time. But that was exactly what he hoped for. With a faint smile, he followed the knights inside. Upon entering the grand courtroom, the head knight announced that Theo Ragnar had been escorted in. One of the officials inside ordered him to be brought forward. Theo, smiling, walked into the court, knowing that if he was going to reveal what he had prepared, it needed to be on a stage as grand as this one. As he surveyed the room, he confirmed that some powerful figures had gathered. Julius, the demon dragon and captain of the white-armored dragon cavalry, Ed Trovian, the sky dragon and director of the Central Intelligence Bureau, Theo Ragnar, the sword dragon and lady of Plum Blossom Palace, and Wolfgang Ragnar, the elder dragon and head counselor. In his past life, Theo would have been overwhelmed by the presence of these powerful figures, barely able to breathe. But now, he was different. Wolfgang called his name, and Theo respectfully responded, acknowledging that it had been a while since they last met. He knew Wolfgang despised half-bloods like him. Illegitimate children were disgusting in Wolfgang's eyes. Theo noticed that Wolfgang didn't even bother hiding his contempt. Wolfgang cut to the chase, telling Theo that pleasantries were unnecessary, and reminding him that he had been summoned to answer for his crimes. He continued, saying that the Byron clan, the Ceres Merchant Guild, the Red and White Mercenary Corps, and even the Hanabi clan were now clamoring to cut ties with the main Ragnar family because of Theo's foolish actions. Wolfgang, filled with anger, shouted at Theo, asking if he, a mere bastard, could bear the damage he had caused. He accused Theo of dragging Ragnar's honor through the dirt and declared that he would be held accountable. Theo, facing the strong enemy calmly, agreed that Wolfgang's words were correct. He admitted he had been careless, which seemed to momentarily calm Wolfgang. But then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Theo added that his mistake was not cutting off their heads, but only their limbs. The room fell silent as Theo continued, explaining that those people were subjects, and the relationship between lord and subject was based on the bestowal of land and honor in exchange for loyalty and lives. That was the way of chivalry. He then raised his voice, accusing the nobles of daring to threaten their lord and asserting that if he had known they would be so insolent, he would have executed them immediately. He insisted they must be punished and that the principles of chivalry had to be restored. With intensity, he asked how he could sit by and watch as Ragnar's honor, upheld for over 1,000 years, was trampled. Wolfgang and Ed were left speechless, shocked by Theo's bold words. Julius, on the other hand, smiled to himself, impressed by Theo's resolve, thinking that Theo was as impressive as ever and confident that the situation would end with a normal punishment. Wolfgang, fuming, shouted at Theo, accusing him of mocking the council with his sophistry. But before he could continue, Theo Ragnar interjected. She calmly stated that she had listened to Theo's arguments, and while they were correct in theory, she reminded him that Ragnar's strength alone was not enough to make it great. Surprised, Wolfgang turned to her, but Osa continued, explaining that if Ragnar ignored the voices of their vassals and knights, they would inevitably fall. One cannot rule the world through tyranny alone, she added. Theo respectfully acknowledged her words, saying he would keep them in mind. Theo knew Theo Ragnar was the clan head's first wife, the Sword Dragon, and the most formidable swordsman in the north. She was known to be wise and powerful, and he was relieved that she didn't seem hostile toward him, though he couldn't quite understand why, given her knowledge of the destruction of Rose Palace. Osa then warned him that the punishment he would receive was justified. Theo, maintaining his calm, asked what that punishment would be. Wolfgang, still seething, declared that Theo would face 3 months of probation. Theo pointed out that the awakening ceremony was in 2 months, prompting Wolfgang to shout at him for daring to talk back. Osa, however, calmly explained that they had taken that into consideration and decided to allow him to participate in next year's ceremony instead. She also added that the 15 children injured by him would likewise participate next year. Ed, observing quietly, thought to himself that Julius's opposition to harsher punishment had lightened Theo's sentence. However, this outcome still worked in their favor. Delaying Theo's participation in the awakening ceremony was a significant dishonor within Ragnar, especially for the one representing Rose Palace. This dishonor would give Camellia Palace ample justification to overshadow Rose Palace. Once their plan was in motion, Ed believed Theo would be powerless to stop it. He even considered that if Theo foolishly attempted to appeal, they could simply eliminate him. But Ed didn't believe Theo would be that reckless. Suddenly, to the shock of everyone in the room, Theo announced that he wanted to appeal. The strongest dragons in the room were visibly stunned. Ed grinned widely, thinking that Theo's arrogance truly knew no bounds, making their plans even easier. Julius, worried, asked Theo if he understood what appealing truly meant. Theo confidently replied that he did. Theo knew his punishment, which was a mere 3-month probation, wasn't something that could be resolved so lightly. It was nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and he suspected that Julius had pulled some strings to secure such leniency. Still, Theo had no intention of accepting even that minor punishment. In the strong and proud Ragnar clan, appealing meant war. Theo declared that, in the end, only the victor could speak the truth, and he intended to be rewarded, not punished. As Theo spoke, the system notified him that he had entered the main scenario. The dragons were stunned by his audacity. The system informed him that this scenario would reveal many secrets hidden within the tightly sealed world of Ragnar, encouraging him to succeed. His scenario quest number 1 was labeled The Successor's Path. Meanwhile, at the hidden northern branch of the Sears Merchant Guild, chaos reigned. The guild building was being burned to the ground, and a figure in a cape swiftly swung a sword, cutting down one of the guild members with ease. As the destruction finished and the last of the guild members lay dead, the cloaked figure turned around. It was Evelyn. She heard Remington approaching, confirming that this was the place they had been searching for, just as their young Lord Theo had predicted. Remington, holding a small chest, showed it to her and declared that Camellia Palace, under the Troyvian name, was finished. Back at the courtroom, Ed, unaware of what had just transpired, smiled confidently, thinking that their plans were proceeding smoothly and without interruption. Once the head dragons calmed down, Wolfgang addressed Theo, incredulous. He questioned whether Theo truly intended to escalate an issue that could be resolved with just 3 months of probation into a full-blown war, accusing him of being beyond arrogant. Wolfgang then asked if Theo believed he alone could stand against the combined forces of the 15 clans. Theo calmly responded that it was something he would handle himself. He added that in cases where there is a vast power imbalance, isn't it normal to resolve appeals through proxy battles? Julius knew that typically, an appeal meant deciding the outcome through war. However, when an outright war was nearly impossible due to a massive power disparity, a proxy battle, where each side sends a representative for a one-on-one duel, would be held. In this case, the representative of the defendant would naturally be Theo, while it was highly likely that Action would represent the plaintiff. Julius realized that if Action became Theo's opponent, it was almost guaranteed Theo would lose. He began to wonder if Theo had some hidden strategy or if he was under the mistaken belief that either Julius or Evelyn would step forward as his representative. If so, Julius thought Theo would be gravely disappointed. Theo then proposed that, following the established rules, they choose their representatives and hold the proxy battle in 1 week. He asked the council how they felt about his suggestion. Ed, deep in thought, figured this was Theo's tactic to rely on either Julius or Evelyn to fight for him, knowing their personalities would prevent them from doing so. This would leave Theo no choice but to fight himself. Ed decided that Action would be sent to crush Theo, and through this, Theo would learn his place. Ed was just about to voice his agreement with Theo's appeal and announce Action as the representative when they were interrupted by a familiar voice. Every person in the room was stunned when they recognized it. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked the clan head, Kyle Ragnar, who remarked that Theo had become quite adept at such sly schemes. Addressing Theo as his son, Kyle commented on how much Theo had changed since the last time they had met. Immediately, the head dragons bowed to their knees to greet their clan head, and Theo followed suit, bowing deeply as he introduced himself as apprentice swordsman Theo Ragnar. He respectfully greeted Kyle, referring to him as the incarnation of the great dragon god. At that moment, the system popped up in front of Theo, revealing that his first scenario quest was titled The Path of the Successor. To achieve this, he needed to take over Camellia Palace and uncover its secrets. Theo knew this was his first main quest since completing the tutorial, and wondered about the significance of the Camellia Palace secret. His thoughts turned to the blue light he had seen earlier. He had been too caught up in recent events to pursue it, but now he realized there was definitely something important there. However, Theo reminded himself that this wasn't the time to get distracted. He peeked up at his father, recognizing that an unpredictable and dangerous variable had just entered the situation. His carefully laid plans could be thrown off course with Kyle's unexpected arrival, and Theo couldn't help but wonder why his father had come. Kyle ordered Theo to stand, which he did immediately. The clan had then told him that he had heard about the situation by chance on his way to the tribunal and understood that Theo was in a complicated position. Kyle continued, saying that he also heard Theo wish to resolve the matter through an appeal via proxy battle, to which Theo confirmed that it was correct. Kyle looked at Theo and said that if he planned to go through with a proxy battle, it would be difficult for him to enter the fight himself. He then asked Theo who he intended to choose as his proxy, knowing this was a test. Ed, alarmed by the exchange, watched closely. Theo, however, confidently responded by asking what Kyle meant by someone standing in his place. He declared that there was no one else, and he had always intended to fight for himself in the appeal. Kyle, intrigued, told Theo he would lose, but Theo calmly replied, "How can you know unless I try?" He then confidently told his father that even if forced to bend, he would never lower himself willingly. Kyle smiled and burst into laughter, turning to the others in the room. He repeated Theo's words aloud, even if forced to bend, he will not lower himself willingly. Kyle proudly proclaimed that no better description of a Ragnar existed than that. Kyle shouted with satisfaction, clearly pleased with Theo's attitude, and thanked him for his boldness. Theo smiled, knowing the proxy battle was just bait. He wasn't actually planning to fight. The proof of Camellia Palace's treasonous conspiracy, which he had tasked Evelyn and Remington to uncover, would secure his victory without a single sword being drawn. It felt good to speak the truth freely. Then, unexpectedly, Kyle told Theo that he wished to give him a personal opportunity. As the Master of Ragnar, Kyle announced that he wanted to test a single strike against Theo. The statement left everyone, including Theo, stunned. Kyle explained that if Theo could endure just one strike from him, he would absolve Theo of all charges. Theo was left confused by the sudden shift. Kyle turned away and ordered Theo to follow him outside for the test. Before Theo could respond, Ed shouted, trying to intervene. Ed knew that for Kyle to offer a test of strength meant he acknowledged Theo as a worthy opponent. If Theo managed to survive the strike, it would signal the clan head's approval. Ed didn't believe Theo could endure Kyle's strike, but the mere possibility of Theo succeeding filled him with dread. Ed needed to stop Theo from gaining favor in the clan head's eyes. Ed argued that allowing vassals and bannermen to comment on the bloodline of Kyle's son was unacceptable. He suggested sticking to the rules and proceeding with the proxy battle instead. But Kyle, in a stern voice, addressed Ed as Sky Dragon and ordered him to shut up. Kyle declared that if a vassal dared to speak in such a way, they could simply get rid of them. Ed, silenced, reluctantly replied that he understood. Kyle then noticed Julius giggling quietly and asked if there was something he wished to say, since he had been laughing for quite some time. Julius, grinning, said it was nothing and explained that it had just been a while since Kyle had shown such interest in something. Kyle waved it off, saying Julius spoke nonsense, and cut the small talk short. Turning his attention back to Theo, Kyle asked Theo directly, "How about my suggestion? Will you accept it?" Theo realized that the situation had taken a completely unexpected turn, and his original plan had crumbled. Still, he welcomed such changes. Smiling, Theo told Kyle that the test seemed far too heavy for him, and he asked how a single strike from the clan head could compare to a proxy war against vassals and bannermen. Kyle raised an eyebrow and asked if Theo was saying he wouldn't accept the challenge. Theo quickly clarified that he wasn't refusing but merely pointing out how much stricter the trial had become. Kyle, impressed, asked what Theo meant by that. Theo, looking up at the head dragons and then fixing his gaze on Ed, replied that the stakes should be adjusted accordingly. Specifically, he suggested compensation for such a harsh test. Kyle, intrigued, asked what compensation Theo had in mind. Theo boldly responded, something like Camellia Palace. His words left the room in stunned silence, and Ed's face contorted with shock and anger. Ed, quietly muttering under his breath, called Theo a brat. Meanwhile, Wolfgang thought the situation was sheer madness. He couldn't believe Theo had the audacity to propose a deal with the clan head. To Wolfgang, the half-blood Theo clearly didn't know his place. He believed Theo's arrogance would be his undoing, as making a deal implied that both parties were equals. But to Wolfgang's shock, Kyle agreed with Theo. Kyle turned to Theo, stating that if he truly aimed to become the successor, he needed to show at least that much boldness. He then asked Ed if he had any objections. Ed, knowing he couldn't openly defy the clan head, responded with feigned humility, saying that everything in Ragnar belonged to Kyle and he wouldn't dare comment on his decisions. Satisfied, Kyle ordered preparations to be made immediately, telling the council to ready the stage for Theo's trial. As Kyle turned to leave the room, he remarked that he would test Theo there and now. Theo remained quiet but smiled, knowing his plan was taking shape. Later, on the stage, Kyle and the dragon head stood on one side while Theo stood on the other. Ed fumed internally, frustrated that the trap he had laid to catch Theo had somehow transformed into a stage that could elevate him. Despite his growing anxiety, Ed reassured himself that Theo couldn't possibly withstand a single strike from the clan head, a feat even high-ranked swordsmen struggled with. With a malicious grin, Ed imagined Theo's death on that very stage. On the other hand, Theo was fully aware of Ed's thoughts, knowing Ed expected him to die there. But Theo smiled, confident that this wouldn't happen, thanks to a tutorial reward he had received. Kyle, noticing something unusual, asked Theo if he had consumed an elixir while no one was watching. He observed that even if Theo had taken one, such rapid growth should be impossible. But Kyle shrugged it off, saying it didn't matter how Theo had become stronger. Sharp as ever, Kyle had detected the change in Theo, even when the other dragons hadn't. Kyle acknowledged that, at the end of the day, Theo was still his flesh and blood. Kyle then asked Theo if he was warmed up, to which Theo replied that he was. Kyle explained that normally, he would use his greatsword. But since Theo didn't yet know how to use mana, he would settle for a rusty steel sword. He asked the other dragon heads if they had any objections, to which they all replied in agreement, of course not. As Kyle began releasing his aura, Theo was overwhelmed by the intense pressure radiating from his father. The sheer force of Kyle's fighting spirit made the air feel heavy, and Theo could hardly stand, his body trembling under the weight of it. Kyle noticed and commented that he was surprised Theo was still standing. Despite the crushing pressure, Theo smiled proudly. He knew he was only able to withstand the force because his strength stat had nearly tripled, thanks to the experience elixir he had received as a reward for clearing the tutorial. The elixir had granted him 5 additional levels, and he had allocated all the points into strength. As a result, his level had increased by 7, and his strength had shot up to 52. Theo felt an exhilarating sense of freedom, as if he had left the realm of the ordinary and stepped into the extraordinary. With his newfound strength, he believed he could block a single strike from his father. Kyle raised his sword, and everyone held their breath in suspense. When Kyle released the sword in Theo's direction, Theo quickly positioned himself, bracing for the impact. The sword connected, causing the floor beneath him to explode and shatter into pieces from the immense power. Thick smoke filled the air from the destroyed ground, but as it cleared, Kyle was stunned to see that Theo had managed to block his strike. Kyle, impressed, released Theo and began walking away. Before leaving, Kyle remarked that it had been a long time since he had found a decent son. At that moment, Theo's sword cracked and shattered into pieces, just as he collapsed from exhaustion and lost consciousness. Ed and Wolfgang were in disbelief that Theo had withstood the blow, while Julius and Osa looked relieved. Kyle then announced that Theo Ragnar had proven his innocence through sheer will, and the trial was concluded. The system appeared in front of Theo, congratulating him for successfully completing the sudden quest, Single Strike of Kyle Ragnar. As a reward, he had obtained inventory authority and a blue key. The next day, sunlight streamed through the window, hitting Theo's face, waking him. As he stirred, he asked aloud where he was. Before he could process his surroundings, his mother, Cecilia, rushed in, shouting with relief that he was finally awake. She tearfully asked if he had any idea how terrified she was when she heard he had been struck by the clan head's sword. She frantically asked about his arms and if he was injured, urging him to move his shoulder to check for any fractures or dislocations. Theo sat up, reassuring his mother that he was fine and telling her to calm down. Looking around, Theo asked his mother where they were. Just then, Julius entered the room, informing him that by order of the clan head, the former lady of Camellia Palace, Emil, along with Action and the director of intelligence, Ed, had been removed. Shocked, Theo asked if that meant he had passed. Julius, with a proud smile, confirmed it, telling Theo that he was currently in the Camellia Palace. The system popped up again, showing that the scenario had been updated and that Theo had achieved the Camellia Palace mission. His last mission was to uncover Camellia Palace's secret. Meanwhile, outside Camellia Palace, Emil furiously stomped her feet, shouting in disbelief at being forced to vacate what she believed to be her rightful property. Enraged, she repeatedly stomped her feet into the ground, ignoring her servants' desperate pleas for her to calm down and compose herself. Inside, Ed seethed with anger as he called Action. He ordered Action to kill Theo Ragnar. Action, nonchalantly, responded that he planned to take Theo's arm during the upcoming awakening ceremony. However, Ed, filled with fury, told Action to take Theo's head instead. Action, noticing the wrathful expression on his uncle's face, realized the gravity of the situation. Back inside Camellia Palace, Theo was deep in thought. Events had taken a completely different direction than he had anticipated. But the outcome was far better than he could have hoped for. He had gained control of Camellia Palace without even using his trump card. On top of that, he had acquired a second authority, the inventory. Curious, he opened his inventory, reached inside, and pulled out an apple. He took a bite while walking around, marveling at the concept of being able to store and retrieve objects seemingly out of thin air. Though he didn't fully understand how it worked, he knew it would prove incredibly useful. Theo reached into the inventory again and pulled out the blue key. It was categorized as a miscellaneous item, and its effect was listed as dungeon opening with matching dungeon gate requirement. He looked over at the room that had been emitting a blue light earlier and realized that the blue key was connected to that mysterious room. Theo inserted the blue key into the lock, and as he had expected, it fit perfectly. When the door opened, however, he was shocked to find not just another room but a cave hidden behind it. The system popped up, informing him that he had discovered a dungeon for the first time and that all experience earned inside would be doubled as a reward. Theo couldn't believe there was a cave concealed within Camellia Palace and figured this had to be tied to some sort of quest. Determined not to miss out on the doubled experience, he stepped forward, but paused, realizing he shouldn't enter empty-handed. A moment later, after loading up his inventory with a swarm of swords, Theo proceeded into the dungeon armed with a sword and shield. As he ventured deeper into the cave, he heard movement around him. His eyes widened in surprise as he came face to face with a massive white wolf, easily large enough to be a demonic beast. The wolf wasted no time and lunged at him. Fortunately, Theo reacted quickly, blocking its jaws with his shield just in time. Pretty strong, he muttered to the beast before swinging his sword at its side. He shouted, determined to show the wolf they wouldn't lose in a contest of strength. However, the wolf was quick, it released his shield and leaped back, narrowly avoiding his attack. The wolf bared its fangs and launched at him again, and Theo charged forward to meet it. He slashed at the beast, but it seemed unfazed, continuing its assault. Theo blocked with his shield, realizing just how tough the creature's hide was. It was fast too, his regular attacks weren't going to be enough to hurt it. This is no ordinary wolf, Theo thought, recalling tales of demonic beasts from the Demon Sea beyond the northern wall. This creature could easily be as powerful as one of those. As the wolf swiped its sharp claws at him, Theo ducked just in time to avoid the strike and dashed forward, thinking back to the ray of light he had seen when facing his father's single strike. Kyle's attack had been a perfect, breathtaking arc of pure white energy. Theo raised his sword, trying to mimic his father's technique, and swung down at the wolf, but the beast easily dodged by tilting its head to the side. The wolf leaped backward as Theo cursed under his breath, replicating that strike wasn't going to be easy. He realized that a single strike referred to delivering a blow so powerful that it ensured certain death in one motion. The key, he thought, was pouring everything into one perfect sword stroke. Deciding to focus entirely on his sword skills and the secret arts of speed that Evelyn had taught him, Theo let go of his shield. He jumped high into the air, catching the wolf off guard. The beast looked around, confused, and before it could react, Theo came down from above, driving his sword straight into the wolf's head. The wolf howled in agony as Theo pulled his sword free, blood pouring from one of its eyes. Theo smiled, satisfied with his success. The wolf, now blinded in one eye, growled in rage. Confident that he could finish the fight, Theo dashed toward the injured beast, ready for the final strike. 2 months later, at training ground number 4, Aud noted the growing number of people gathering, and Sybil agreed, suggesting they might need to switch training grounds due to the increasing crowd. Ever since word spread that Kyle Ragnar had taught Theo the famed single strike, more and more people were eager to spar with him. As they were discussing, Henry Morris from Plum Blossom Palace interrupted, mocking them and asking when their incredible young master would finally show up. He pointed out that it had been 2 months and hinted that perhaps Theo had run away after the story about him winning the trial had spread too far. He even implied that Theo might have exaggerated his achievements, especially since there were no witnesses to his victory at the trial or his confrontation with the Scaled Dragon Society. Before Henry could continue, Sybil landed a punch square on his face, sending him flying back. One of Henry's companions started to shout, furious at Sybil's audacity, but quickly fell silent when he noticed the glares of the knights surrounding Sybil. Seething with anger, Sybil insulted Henry and his group, declaring that they were nothing compared to Theo. Aud, attempting to diffuse the tension, made a lighthearted comment about Sybil's own appearance, but Sybil, still fuming, insisted that he didn't care about such things. He was fed up with these troublemakers and wasn't about to let them insult their young master. With that, Sybil called on his comrades to draw their swords, declaring that the fight was on. The Plum Blossom Palace knights followed suit, readying their weapons. Before the clash could escalate, a figure with long blue hair suddenly appeared, freezing the swords of both sides. The group was taken aback, recognizing the individual as Frost's sword, Theo Ragnar, one of the 4 hounds of the north. Moments later, loud laughter echoed through the training ground. Another figure appeared, announcing his presence, Black Bear, Hulkus Lank, another of the 4 hounds. The knights were shocked to see 2 members of the 4 hounds present. Hulkus, however, seemed disappointed by the gathering, asking where Theo was, referring to him as Luster Tiger and making it clear that he had come to challenge Theo personally. Meanwhile, deep within Camellia Palace's dungeon, Theo sat exhausted, sweat dripping down his face as he held his half-broken sword. The system continued to notify him that he had leveled up several times. He had been hunting demonic beasts relentlessly, and the system showed that he had taken down 170 so far. There was only 1 beast left in the dungeon, 1 out of 171. As Theo rested against the body of a slain wolf, a loud growl echoed from nearby. His status window popped up, revealing his current stats: level 15, strength 91, vitality 20, intelligence 19, allocatable stats 0, dexterity 25, magic power 198, luck -6, unknown stats 2. Theo retrieved a potion from his inventory and drank it. Within seconds, his wounds healed and he felt his strength returning. He knew he'd come close to death several times during his time in the dungeon, but the beginner healing potion, which restored 10% of his health and wounds, had saved him repeatedly. Surveying the bodies of the demonic beasts he had slain, Theo reflected on how tough the fights had been at the start. However, as he leveled up, things had gotten progressively easier. Time had flown by, and it was hard to believe that 2 months had already passed since he entered the dungeon. Looking around, Theo realized that with only 1 beast remaining, it meant the boss was about to appear. He ascended the stairs to the 5th floor, where the final challenge awaited. As he walked, he noticed that his sword had been completely destroyed during the battles. Discarding the broken weapon, he pulled another sword from his inventory, a ceremonial blade his mother had gifted him for his birthday. He examined the sword, remembering how, in his previous life, he had dismissed it. There had been friction between him and his mother leading up to the awakening ceremony, and he had carelessly tossed the sword aside, leaving it to rust. Now, upon closer inspection, he saw that it was a fine blade, forged from rare white snow steel. He paused for a moment, lost in the memory of that day. Cecilia had barged into his room, excitedly wishing him a happy birthday while the servants followed, arms laden with gifts. She had waited until midnight to surprise him. But in his frustration, Theo had shouted at her, angrily telling her that with the awakening ceremony approaching, he had no time for birthdays or presents. He had coldly reminded her that no amount of good equipment could change one's bloodline, leaving her speechless and hurt. Now, in this life, Theo vowed not to repeat the mistakes of his past. Theo continued toward the boss area, determined to move forward. The system notified him that he had reached the boss room, warning him to be cautious as a strong demonic beast would soon appear. When he entered the chamber, his breath caught at the sight of massive claws, a long tail, and a large, terrifying maw. It was a dragon, or rather, a lesser drake, slumbering before him. As he approached cautiously, he let out a small sigh of relief. It wasn't a full dragon, just a lesser drake. Still, he was wary. Theo recalled the legends of the Ragnar clan, said to be descendants of dragons. The final boss of this strange quest seemed to have a draconic form, making him wonder if it was more than mere coincidence. He wasn't entirely sure what it all meant, but one thing was clear: he needed to defeat the drake to clear the dungeon and complete the quest. The system displayed the remaining objective for scenario quest number 1, showing the final demonic beast of the dungeon. Taking a deep breath, Theo prepared himself for the battle. He questioned whether he could actually defeat it, considering it was still a kind of dragon. As he positioned himself for the fight, he decided to use the single flash technique. He had practiced the move enough against the dire wolves in the dungeon, and although it wasn't on the same level as his father's dragon flash, Theo believed that if he fully harnessed the power of his dragon heart, he could land a serious blow. He dashed forward, sword ready, focusing his energy. The drake sensed the danger and opened its eyes, but Theo was faster. With precision, he executed the single flash, his sword piercing one of the drake's eyes. Blood poured from the wound, confirming that his plan had worked. The drake swung its massive tail at Theo, but he managed to jump away just in time to avoid being crushed. He had hoped to pierce the creature's brain, but his attack hadn't reached that far. Nonetheless, he saw the potential. The drake growled, its anger palpable. Theo raised his sword and dashed toward it once more, activating his secret technique, Jester's footwork, which allowed him to leap around it with incredible speed while slashing. For a brief moment, Theo believed he could win. He launched another attack, aiming to distract the drake with a normal strike before going for a weak point. Just as Theo was about to follow through with his plan, the drake let out a bone-chilling scream. The system immediately warned him that the drake had activated its fear ability, dominating the battlefield. Theo was shocked as his approach came to a halt. His body froze, and the system alerted him again. Fear had reduced his movement by 10%. The drake's intense gaze paralyzed him, and he couldn't move a muscle. The drake's claws came crashing toward him, and though Theo attempted to block with his sword, the sheer force threw him back, slamming him hard into the cave wall. Blood trickled down from his head. The drake was proving to be a true boss-level opponent, and Theo knew that if he didn't end the battle soon, things would get far worse. Gathering his resolve, he dashed forward once more, locking eyes with the drake as it lunged at him. He quickly identified its weak point, its reverse scale on the neck. As the drake's jaws came down toward his head, Theo ducked at full speed, thrusting his sword into the exposed reverse scale with all his might. The blade pierced deep into the drake's neck, causing it to halt in shock. But Theo wasn't done. Using every bit of his remaining strength, he drove the sword in deeper, making the drake scream in agony. For a brief moment, Theo smiled, realizing his strategy had worked. However, the drake, now furious, glared at him with a primal rage and screamed once again. Theo's heart raced as panic set in. Meanwhile, back at training ground number 4, the tension between the knights was thick. Sybil and the others stood in stunned silence. Hulkus, clearly agitated, demanded an explanation from Ray, shouting that Theo Ragnar needed to face him first. Ray, unfazed, dismissed him, stating that losers should stay out of it, which only fueled Hulkus' rage. Hulkus retorted that 3 years had passed since their last duel and that he had improved, enough to close the gap between them. But Ray continued to call him a loser, causing Hulkus to snap. Enraged, he lunged at her, declaring they should duel again to see who deserved to fight Theo. Hulkus swung his massive sword at Ray, but she effortlessly blocked the attack without moving. Sybil, confused by the sudden escalation, asked what was happening, while Henry, still nursing the punch he had received from Sybil earlier, admitted that he didn't know but was terrified. Before the situation could worsen, Remington appeared, swiftly stepping between Ray and Hulkus, using his sword to stop their clash. Remington reminded them that if they wanted to brawl, they should do it elsewhere. He wouldn't allow them to cause trouble in Theo's domain while their master was away. Hulkus, seemingly unbothered, greeted Remington cheerfully and stated that he had been wanting to duel him as well. Remington, growing irritated, asked if Hulkus hadn't heard what he just said. But before he could finish, he sensed something. Everyone in the training ground felt it, a powerful and overwhelming force. Remington immediately turned toward the source, wondering what could be radiating such immense killing intent. His eyes widened as he realized it was coming from none other than Theo, who was slowly approaching them. The pressure emanating from Theo was suffocating, leaving Remington to wonder what had happened to him during his 2 months of seclusion. Ray, on the other hand, remained quiet, simply observing him. Hulkus, however, smiled widely upon seeing Theo, eager for their confrontation. Theo carried was that of the lesser drakes, a power strong enough to dominate the battlefield. A moment ago, in the dungeon, the drake glared at Theo in anger after letting out a final roar. For a brief moment, Theo braced himself for another attack, but instead, the drake collapsed to the ground, dead. The system congratulated him for successfully hunting the lesser drake. As Theo pulled his sword from the creature's reverse scale, he reflected on how close he had come to being defeated. When the drake had begun thrashing wildly after he struck its weak spot, he genuinely thought it was over. Exhausted, he lay down on the drake's body, relieved that it had worn itself out over time. He reaffirmed that the reverse scale was indeed the weak spot. The system displayed his rewards, a lesser drake's tooth and a lesser drake's claw. The description revealed that the tooth was a material used in weapon crafting to increase durability, while the claw could be used to enhance a weapon's sharpness. Theo was surprised at the usefulness of these items and glanced at his worn-out sword, thinking he should use the materials to repair it. It was, after all, the sword his mother had gifted him, and the drake battle had taken its toll on the blade. Another notification appeared, informing him that he had obtained the lesser drake's fear skill, rank D with 1% mastery. The skill granted him the ability to release the unique killing intent of a drake, overwhelming those nearby and inflicting fear on weaker targets. Theo was astonished. Dragon killing intent was a power reserved for the chosen few. He couldn't believe he had acquired such a rare ability. Excited at the possibilities, though uncertain of its immediate usefulness in a place like Ragnar, where powerhouses were abundant, he stored the drake's tooth, claw, and his sword in his inventory before leaving the boss room. The system confirmed he had successfully cleared the Camellia Palace dungeon. Later, as he exited the dungeon room, Theo felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had completed the quest. The system once again congratulated him, presenting him with a reward for clearing scenario quest number 1, a nest compass. The compass, listed as a miscellaneous item, had the effect of guiding the holder toward a nest. Theo stared at the strange object, wondering what it could mean and if it was tied to his next quest. Unsure of its immediate use, he stored it in his inventory for safekeeping. As he began to walk toward his room to rest, his exhaustion made each step more difficult. Suddenly, a maid rushed toward him, shouting that something urgent had happened. Frustration surged through him. He just wanted to rest. But he turned to face the maid. The maid was visibly shocked upon seeing his disheveled appearance and the blood on his clothes. Worried, she asked where he had been, but Theo brushed it off, telling her it was nothing. When he asked what the matter was, the maid panicked, explaining that there was a brawl happening at training ground number 4. Shortly after, Theo arrived at the training ground, visibly irritated. Without hesitation, he activated his new lesser drake's fear skill, unleashing a wave of killing intent as he commanded everyone to leave. Those weaker than him were instantly overwhelmed, collapsing under the weight of his presence. Hulkus noticed the power Theo was radiating and smiled in satisfaction, clearly impressed. Laughing, Hulkus dashed toward Theo, eager to test his strength. He proclaimed that he knew Theo would be fun and swung his sword at him with full force. However, Theo easily deflected Hulkus' attack with a swift upward swing, sending Hulkus flying backward. The sheer force of Theo's counter shocked everyone present, including Remington and Ray. Hulkus, still reeling from the deflection, couldn't believe how effortlessly his strike had been repelled. Hulkus forcefully stood to his feet and furiously shouted that there was no way he was taking it. Black Bear, like Hulkus Lank, had always been considered one of the weakest of the 4 Hounds of the North because Hulkus hadn't fully developed his skills and wasn't particularly smart either. Hulkus then swung his massive sword down at him, yelling for him to try blocking it. He braced himself, knowing that as a member of the Lank clan, Hulkus had never been outmatched in terms of strength. He blocked Hulkus' sword and deflected it by swinging his own blade downward. Then, using his single flash technique, he sliced Hulkus. A proud smile crossed his face as he realized that he had just parried Hulkus' powerful sword and even countered it. He thought to himself that all the effort spent leveling up had been worth it. Hulkus coughed up blood, his body splattered with it, before collapsing to the ground, unconscious. He sighed, realizing that he had unintentionally used his full strength in the swing but was relieved that it was Hulkus Lank, known for his toughness, who had been on the receiving end. This meant Hulkus had merely fainted. Meanwhile, Sybil was shocked, but soon proudly cheered for him along with the other followers, shouting that their young master, Theo, had defeated the Black Bear and taken down one of the 4 hounds with a single strike. His followers continued to cheer, though Theo tried to explain that Hulkus was still alive. Just then, his sword cracked, and half of it fell to the ground, leaving him shocked. Panic set in as he realized that the sword his mother had given him was destroyed. Sybil, however, shouted in admiration, claiming that, as expected of him, he had even broken his sword with a single strike. Annoyed, Theo angrily asked Sybil why he was so happy about it. Meanwhile, Remington and Ray watched from a distance in silence, both in shock. Ray quietly stared at Theo, recalling a time from her childhood when he had asked who she was, why she was walking in the cold, and if she wasn't freezing. He had placed his scarf around her, asking if that would help, but then said she still looked cold. Smiling warmly, he had taken her hand and led her away, promising to bring her to his house until the snow stopped so he could take her home. As Ray remembered this, a soft smile formed on her face. She then turned and walked away, leaving Remington stunned, wondering if Ray Ragnar had really just smiled. Shortly after, back at the palace, Theo found himself at the celebration, wearing a hat and blushing in shyness as the maids joyfully congratulated him on his new title, Luster Tiger. They praised him for achieving the title, excitedly telling him that he had worked so hard for such a long time and just needed to keep up the momentum all the way to the awakening ceremony. Cecilia, his mother, then placed a huge bowl of food on the table, proudly calling him her son. She began feeding him large portions, encouraging him to try the abalone dish. Theo tried to stop his mother, but she continued to feed him, eagerly insisting that he also try the meat from chickens fed only acorns from the western Laxaria desert. As she went on and on, he wanted to stop her, but when he saw how lovingly she was trying to feed him, a wave of sadness washed over him. He remembered seeing her corpse in his past life and became emotional, but he sweetly told her the food was delicious, appreciating her efforts. A little later, after they had finished eating, Theo showed his mother the broken sword. She was shocked, stuttering as she asked what had happened to it. Theo stood off to the side, nervously clutching his full stomach. He explained that the sword had broken during training and apologized sadly for destroying the precious gift she had given him for his birthday. To his surprise, Cecilia angrily cursed an old woman, causing Theo to look at her in confusion. She shouted that the damn old woman had sworn that because the sword was made from white snow steel and ebony steel wood, it would never break. Theo, still perplexed, asked if she meant the ebony steel wood from the southern Gaia jungle. Cecilia confirmed, explaining that the old woman had claimed only rare and precious materials were used. But clearly, that was a lie since the sword had broken so easily. Theo knew that ebony steel wood was a peculiar plant that grew by feeding on iron, making it a rare material that retained the flexibility of wood while being as sturdy as steel. He recognized that the sword was of high quality but hadn't realized it was so valuable. He wondered just where his mother had obtained such a sword. Cecilia, still furious, declared that it wouldn't do and that she would confront the old woman for an explanation. She added that the old woman had better replace the sword with one that was perfect for her son. Theo assured his mother that he was fine and could simply use another sword. But Cecilia disagreed. She insisted that now that people had begun to recognize his true worth, they needed to be even more meticulous, especially with the awakening ceremony less than a week away. She refused to let him attend the ceremony with a shabby, broken sword. Theo sighed and smiled at her determination. Turning to leave, Cecilia told him that since they were already discussing it, they should go right away. Theo picked up the broken sword from the table and asked where they were headed. She replied confidently, saying they were going to the best workshop in all of Winterra, the Basque Workshop. The Basque Workshop, one of the 3 major weapon manufacturing centers in Winterra, was renowned not only for its enormous size, rivaling that of a factory, but for another key reason. The most notable aspect of the workshop was its master, a figure classified as special rank by the intelligence agency and a blacksmith who held the prestigious title of Master Craftsman, a title shared by only 2 other Ragnar artisans. This person was also known by the fearsome nicknames the Elf of Capitalism Incarnate and the Demon Craftsman Curson. Theo couldn't believe he was about to meet such a legend and wondered how his mother knew the Demon Craftsman. To his surprise, Cecilia casually asked Curson if she was still smoking and called Curson her mother, leaving Theo both shocked and confused. Curson immediately rebuffed the term mother, reminding Cecilia that their relationship had ended the day Cecilia chose to run away. This revelation left Theo stunned. He had always believed his mother to be an orphan with no remaining family. The fact that Curson, a high elf, was his grandmother made Theo realize that he was a quarter elf himself, which might explain his striking appearance. Curson, addressing Cecilia, asked what had brought their dear customer to the workshop when she had never visited before. Without missing a beat, Cecilia tossed the broken sword to Curson, replying that she was there to return a defective product. Curson caught the sword, visibly irritated, and retorted, asking how Cecilia could dare to call a sword forged by her, Curson, defective. However, Curson's annoyance quickly turned to shock as she examined the destroyed weapon. Cecilia, unfazed, pressed Curson, asking if it wasn't a defective product, then what was it? Meanwhile, Theo stood to the side, still trying to process that he was a quarter elf. Curson then asked who had wielded the sword. Cecilia pointed to her son, and Curson, gesturing to Theo, asked if it was the boy behind her. Cecilia quickly corrected her, instructing Curson to watch her words, reminding her that Theo was a genius who would one day rule over Ragnar. Theo then respectfully introduced himself to Curson, expressing his honor at meeting the renowned master of the Basque workshop. Curson, still fixated on the broken sword, responded that she had heard of him and complimented Cecilia on raising her son well. She then turned back to the matter at hand and asked Theo directly if he was indeed the one who had wielded the sword. When he confirmed this, Cecilia once again insisted that the sword was defective. Curson, however, remained calm, stating that the explanation would be lengthy and invited them to follow her inside for further discussion. As they followed Curson, Theo asked his mother how she was connected to the demon craftsman. Cecilia replied that it was just as he had heard. He asked if Curson was truly her mother, to which Cecilia clarified that although she rarely spoke of her past, Curson had been her foster mother for a brief period of 6 months. This revelation hit Theo. Curson was not his grandmother, but rather his mother's foster parent, meaning he wasn't a half-elf after all. Cecilia added that Curson had always been drawn to anything she considered beautiful, whether it was jewels, music, theater, or even people, which was why she had taken Cecilia in as her foster daughter. She speculated that Curson must have liked her a great deal. At this, Curson interjected, cutting off the conversation, stating that they had talked enough about the past and that there was no point in dwelling on it. Cecilia, however, teased Curson, betting that she didn't truly feel that way, which irritated Curson further, though she continued walking in silence. Theo then asked his mother how she ended up leaving that place. Just as Cecilia was about to reply, Curson interrupted, telling him that Cecilia left on her own 2 feet, saying she'd become the Ragnar clan head's wife. Curson added that she couldn't believe Cecilia would willingly go to such a miserable place, calling it a foolish decision. Still, she acknowledged it was commendable that Cecilia had survived there as long as she did. Cecilia, however, shrugged it off, saying that the clan head was just too handsome, dashing, and manly, and he loved her dearly. Curson scoffed, retorting that despite running away from home, Cecilia had come crawling back last year to ask her to forge a sword as a gift for her son. Curson added that she had never seen such shamelessness, prompting Cecilia to shout at Curson to stop. Cecilia then turned to Curson, asking why she would say such things in front of her son. Curson merely responded by asking if she was wrong, which made Theo smile. He had never seen his mother speak in such a way before and realized that he hadn't learned much about her in his past life. He thought himself an ungrateful son, perhaps too obsessed and consumed by clan matters. As he looked at his mother, he realized the demon craftsman seemed to genuinely care for her, and he wondered why his mother had kept quiet about this in his previous life. Curson abruptly stopped walking and announced that they had arrived. She pointed to a room, stating it was her master's office. Cecilia asked why they had come so far inside and demanded that Curson give Theo the best sword ever to make up for her mistake. Curson, ignoring her, told Cecilia to wait outside and gestured for Theo to enter the office with her, leaving Cecilia shocked and confused. Once inside, Curson stared at Theo angrily, while Cecilia continued to call out from outside. Curson spoke, saying she would be straightforward. She asked Theo if he possessed a relic of the Primordial dragon. Confused, Theo asked if she was referring to the ancestor of the guardian dragon that protected the Ragnar clan. He explained that he had heard the legend, how their progenitors scattered the primordial dragon's treasures across Wintra for the descendants of the Ragnar clan. Curson then pulled out the broken sword and shouted that she could tell he was feigning ignorance, which shocked him. She tearfully showed him the destroyed sword, asking how it had ended up in such a state if he truly didn't possess a relic. She had poured her heart and soul into forging that sword, and there was no way it would break unless it had clashed with a relic. Tears in her eyes, Curson asked if he had any idea how much the sword had cost her. Theo apologized, knowing the sword had only been damaged during his battle with the Drake, but he couldn't understand why Curson kept mentioning a relic. Curson turned around, telling him to forget about it and that it would be faster to show her instead. She pulled out an object covered in chains and asked Theo what he saw. Theo looked at it and noticed it emitted a blue light, just like the glow he had seen from the door to the dungeon in Camellia Palace. Curson admitted that she couldn't see or feel anything from it but sensed from his reaction that he saw something. Frustrated, Curson explained that she had tried countless times to open it to obtain the item inside but had never succeeded. She then placed the object on the ground in front of him, declaring it to be the relic of the Primordial Dragon. Curson explained that long ago, in the Age of Myths, the Primordial Dragon had removed one of its fangs and forged it into a blade known as the White Moonlight Blade. She told Theo that if he could break the seal on the case and successfully retrieve the sword, she would give him the White Moonlight Blade. Theo was surprised by the offer, but Curson warned him that he might lose his life in the process. She asked if he wanted to try. For a moment, Theo didn't respond. Then, with determination, he declared that the sword was his. Just then, the system interface appeared before him, displaying the scenario quest number 2, the path of the successor. His mission was to be chosen by the Primordial Dragon's relic, the White Moonlight Blade. The White Moonlight Blade, sword of the leader of Black Snow and one of the 9 dragons, the Black Dragon, was shrouded in mystery. Few people knew what the sword actually looked like because almost everyone who had seen or spoken of it either disappeared or died. However, by sheer coincidence, Theo had once seen the true form of the White Moonlight Blade when he encountered the Black Dragon. He remembered asking the Black Dragon if he could actually see the sword. And against all odds, the dragon had allowed it, leaving Theo to wonder why he had been spared. He knew then that the Black Dragon's White Moonlight sword was a relic of the Primordial Dragon. 4 years later, Theo ran into the Black Dragon again and realized Curson still had the sword during that time. So when Curson asked him if he wanted to give it a shot, he knew he had to obtain it, no matter the cost. He confidently replied that the sword was his now. As Theo examined the sealed case, he noticed that the lock was similar to the one in Camellia Palace. He pulled out the blue key, suspecting that it might be the key to unlock the case, which greatly surprised Curson. He inserted the key into the lock and twisted it. To his astonishment, the chains around the case released themselves. Curson was equally shocked, but as dark energy began to pour out of the case, she rushed toward Theo. However, the dark power quickly consumed him before she could reach him, leaving Theo to wonder what was happening. Suddenly, he found himself in his old body, standing in the ruins of Rose Palace. Confused, he wondered why he had returned there. Realization hit him, he had forgotten how weak he once was. He needed much more power to defeat Rendon and destroy Camellia Palace. Just then, an eagle appeared before him, ready to attack. But before it could strike, Theo swiftly grabbed its beak with his hand, shutting its mouth. The image of the ruined Rose Palace vanished, and Theo addressed the eagle, incredulous that it had tried to take over his mind by exploiting his desire for power. He realized the sword wasn't called a monster sword for no reason. Shocked, the eagle called him insolent and demanded to know how he had resisted. Theo calmly replied that he had already conquered the despair the sword showed him long ago, calling the eagle dummy. He then asked if it really thought he would be tempted by such a paltry power when he already had quests to complete. The eagle, flustered, shouted back, asking what he was talking about. Gripping the eagle's beak tightly, Theo commented that it didn't resemble the griffin in his memory, which had been at least 10 meters tall. Now, the creature was his height, much smaller. The eagle protested, yelling at him to let go. Theo raised his fist, speculating that the sword must have weakened after being sealed for so long, but added that it worked in his favor. He then swung his fist at the eagle, claiming the White Moonlight sword as his own. Panic spread through the creature, and it stammered, begging him to discuss things civilly. Meanwhile, outside the office, Cecilia was calling out to her son, worriedly pleading with him to wake up. She angrily turned to Curson, demanding to know what was happening and why her son was in such a state. Shouting, Cecilia reminded Curson that she had asked for a sword to be forged, not for this to happen to Theo. Curson, staring at Theo, saw that the monster energy had linked with his bloodstream, something she had never seen or heard of before. She had thought it would be safe because he already possessed a relic, but clearly she had been wrong. Cecilia, furious, warned Curson that if anything terrible happened to her son, she would never forgive her. Curson stood frozen in fear as dark energy from the sword began to crawl toward Theo's hand, unnoticed by either of them. Suddenly, a black aura surrounded Theo, and his body absorbed all of the dark energy. Moments later, as the last of the dark power entered him, his mother, Cecilia, called his name in worry. He regained control of his body, and she immediately hugged him, crying in relief and fear. Theo gently told her that he must have worried her, assuring her that he was fine now and there was no need to be alarmed. Curson sighed in relief as well, while the system congratulated him for hunting a griffin, and notified him that he had completed scenario quest number 2. As a reward, he gained ownership of the White Moonlight sword. Looking at the sword, Theo realized how fortunate he had been. The griffin had been easy to defeat since it had only just been unsealed, and its psychological attacks had failed against him. The system then informed him that by absorbing the sword's monster energy, his magic power had increased significantly, which surprised him. His magic power had risen by 30, pushing his total above 200. This caused his magic power to gain divinity, a special ability that enhanced his body and gave him a 1.5-second magic power recovery effect. He was pleased to have magic power on par with a high-rank swordsman, but felt it was a shame that he couldn't use all of it just yet. He would have to hold back until the awakening ceremony. Curson, somewhat shocked, congratulated him for succeeding, though Cecilia continued to glare at her in anger. Theo then asked Curson if she would keep her promise. Curson smiled and asked if he didn't know that elves cannot lie. At that moment, Theo felt the sword move on its own, and Curson remarked that it was being defiant. Theo, staring at the sword, asked if that meant the sword still hadn't acknowledged him as its master. He noticed the sword almost seemed to sweat in fear under his gaze. Curson explained that it wasn't quite about acknowledging him, but that the sword likely felt stuffy after being trapped for hundreds of years. Now that it was finally free, it wanted to release its pent-up frustration. She pointed to a slashing board and suggested that Theo try swinging at it with all his strength. When he asked if that would be okay, Curson confidently assured him there was no need to worry. She explained that even if it was the white moonlight sword, a swing from someone who hadn't even gone through the awakening ceremony wouldn't be able to damage the Basque workshop. Though her words irritated him slightly, Theo agreed. He thought it was a good opportunity to test the sword's power and use some of his magic energy, especially since he could hide his dragon heart whenever he wanted. Approaching the wall, Theo unwrapped the sword and asked Curson to excuse him as he prepared to strike. He positioned himself and released a bit of his magic power into the sword. The system informed him that the white moonlight sword was a monster sword possessed by a griffin and a relic of the primordial dragon. Theo pulled the sword back, gathering force, which generated a strong wind and pressure around them. Curson, sensing the intensity, tried to stop him, but it was too late. Theo swung the sword forward using his single flash technique. The resulting force not only slashed the wall but cut the entire workshop in half. Cecilia watched in amazement, while Curson stood stunned and speechless at the destruction. Curson panicked when she saw the destruction of her workshop and immediately grew distressed, realizing how much money she was losing. Theo, noticing the damage caused by his sword, realized it might be more dangerous than he had anticipated, as it had absorbed all of his magic power. Before he could react, Curson appeared beside him, surprising him with her speed. She examined him closely and noted that he didn't have a mana hull, confirming that he wasn't proficient in magic. She expressed disbelief that the damage had been done purely by the sword's sharpness, and as she stared at him, she thought of Theo as a genius, her grandson, no less, filling her with excitement. Curson proudly announced that she would be his patron from now on, encouraging him to showcase his talents to the world. In her mind, she envisioned Theo as a perfect advertisement for the Basque workshop. Theo, shocked by her sudden declaration, didn't quite know how to respond. Cecilia, noticing Curson's enthusiasm, brought her back to reality with a remark that made Curson snap out of her money-minded thoughts. Shortly after, Theo and Cecilia said their farewells and left for home. Curson held two large teeth that Theo had given her for the workshop's repairs, recognizing them as loot from a drake. She realized he must have acquired them while obtaining the relic and walked back into her workshop with pride, reflecting on how remarkable her daughter's son had become. As Curson entered the workshop, a voice from behind greeted her, and she immediately recognized it. Frowning, she turned to face the source of the voice and questioned the crow perched in the nearby tree about its presence. The crow simply stared back at her in silence. 5 days later, on the day of the awakening ceremony, Theo was training with Evelyn at the training grounds. He had improved enough to spar with her on equal footing, not only blocking her strikes but also deflecting and counterattacking. Evelyn, impressed with his progress, noted that his swordplay had become faster and more powerful. Theo responded with relief, acknowledging that such praise was unexpected. His followers, watching the sparring session, were amazed at how skillfully he was holding his own against her. Evelyn reflected on the past 6 months, realizing that Theo had grown significantly stronger and could now push her back during their matches. Furthermore, he had awakened his magic power earlier that day. Deciding to stop holding back, Evelyn swung her sword with full strength, but Theo blocked the attack with ease, causing her to smile. She silently thought that Theo might be on the path to becoming something extraordinary. She gave Theo more recognition for his efforts and suggested that he might even aim to be the valedictorian of the awakening ceremony. Theo expressed gratitude, attributing his success to her training. He added that, if he did become valedictorian, he would mention her during his speech at the ceremony. Evelyn, caught off guard by this, felt a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. His followers, overhearing the conversation, eagerly urged Theo to mention them as well in his speech. Amused, Theo sighed, acknowledging how challenging it was to handle all the attention. With a smile, he agreed and then announced that he had to leave. Later, at the central headquarters, Theo arrived at the ceremony room and introduced himself to the guards as Theo Ragnar of Camellia Palace. He knew that the awakening ceremony was the most important annual event for the Ragnar clan. After confirming his identity, the guards opened the door, allowing him to enter. Theo understood that every participant hoped to achieve good results in the ceremony, as it was the first opportunity for Ragnar swordsmen to be acknowledged and honored. This year was especially significant as the entire Ragnar clan, including the clan head, Kyle Ragnar, and the legendary 9 dragons, were watching. Also in attendance was Hilda Ragnar, the former clan head from 2 generations ago. Theo observed that Hilda, despite being over 150 years old, appeared much younger, which reassured him. He was relieved to see her attending once again. The sound of a drum rang out, gathering everyone's attention. Theo Ragnar, a judge and Dragon Gate swordsman, stood before the participants and announced that they would begin the preliminary examination. Theo explained that the participants would be required to grab a sword placed on the ground and leave a mark on a steel wall positioned on the platform. He further clarified that the wall was forged using a mixture of white snow steel, meaning that ordinary steel blades would be unable to scratch it. However, if the participants infused their attacks with magic power, the situation would change. Theo then prepared to distribute Soma to the participants. Theo explained that 1 pill of Soma would grant each participant 10 annuals of magic power. This elixir would help them open their mana halls, enabling them to cut through the white snow steel wall using the provided swords. The depth of each participant's cut would determine their result in the examination. After providing these instructions, Theo called out to the participants, announcing that the first person he named would step forward, take a Soma, and begin. Theo Ragnar was called as participant number 1. He walked toward the stage, recalling that in his past life, Action had been the valedictorian. Approaching the knight standing by the stage, Theo took the Soma and pulled a normal sword from where it was embedded in the floor. As he approached the white snow steel wall, he thought to himself that this time, Action would not claim the title of valedictorian. At that moment, the system interface appeared before Theo, displaying scenario quest number 3, the victor of the awakening ceremony. His mission was to become the valedictorian of the ceremony. Meanwhile, Hilda Ragnar turned to Kyle and asked if Theo was the boy he had mentioned before. Kyle nodded, confirming that Theo had indeed caught his attention. Hilda, intrigued, admitted that she had become curious after hearing that Kyle was keeping an eye on Theo. She remarked that it would be interesting to see just how competent this descendant truly was. Theo relaxed his shoulders, feeling a bit nervous. He guessed it was because it had been a while since he last experienced something like this. Theo instructed him to swallow the Soma, and Theo acknowledged the order, opening his mouth to take it. As he did, he recalled how, in his past life, he had swallowed the Soma but was unable to control the mana, severely injuring his Danshin. This time, however, he was confident that such a mishap wouldn't happen again. As Theo swallowed the Soma, a surge of magic mana erupted from him. Theo was shocked, witnessing the sheer volume of mana spilling out, unable to believe the intensity of the mana wave Theo was generating. Theo thought that Theo might be unable to control it properly. He knew that when someone swallowed Soma, it was crucial to be cautious, as the mana hall needed to settle carefully in the Danshin. Talented Ragnars, with their large amounts of mana, could easily become disabled if they weren't careful. Vihana assumed Theo was in danger as well, expecting him to lose control. To Vihana's astonishment, however, the mana stabilized in Theo's stomach, and he managed to control it completely. Vihana, in disbelief, questioned how Theo had endured it. Theo relieved that he now had both a dragon heart and a mana hall. He thought it was almost too easy this time, compared to his past life. Holding the sword tightly, he knew he was now officially allowed to use mana. With determination, Theo swung the sword backward, releasing mana into it. He ran toward the white steel wall and swung the sword forward, releasing his mana in a powerful burst. As the vast amount of mana poured out, a dragon force emerged from his attack. Remington, Ray, and Hulkus, who were watching, were stunned by the display. The dragon attack flew straight at the white steel wall, cutting it with a single slash technique. The sight of this left Action furious. Theo's attack left a deep, visible scratch on the wall, even from a distance. Vihana, still in disbelief, announced that Theo Ragnar had passed. The crowd, shocked, murmured among themselves. No one had seen something like this since the young master Thorkel, and they questioned whether it was truly the sword slash of someone using mana for the first time. The system then informed Theo that his luck had now reached 0, and the curse of bad luck that had plagued him was finally lifted. As a result, his fame would begin to slowly spread throughout the world. Excitement filled Theo. He was no longer cursed and had now reached the same starting point as everyone else. The system further revealed that many prominent individuals had taken notice of his exceptional performance. Osir Ragnar Plunus wished to take him as a disciple. Julius Ragnar was displeased by the attention Theo was receiving. Robert Ragnar was cautious of him, and Hildur Ragnar had shown a strong interest in him. As Theo stepped off the stage, his thoughts turned to the unexpected interest from both the Black Dragon and the Sword Dragon. However, what mattered most to him was catching Hilda's eye. Knowing that she possessed the heart of Garuda, Theo realized that if he could obtain it, he would become stronger than anyone present at the ceremony. A moment later, Sybil took his turn and slashed the wall, leaving a small scratch that was enough to pass. Proudly, Sybil approached Theo, telling him he had also succeeded. The next 3 participants were Ray Ragnar, Hulkus Lank, and Remington Narcio. All of them passed, each leaving deep scratches on the wall. Sybil couldn't help but notice that all 3 of the 4 Hounds of the North had achieved monstrous results, yet none of them had made a mark as impressive as his young master, Theo. Sybil knew that the only one left to go was Action Ragnar, considered the strongest of the 4 Hounds. The participants began to whisper among themselves, some commenting that it had become a contest between the Luster Tiger, Theo, and the Dark Tiger, Action. Others doubted even Action would be able to surpass Theo's feat, which visibly angered Action. He rushed to the stage, clearly determined to prove himself. Vihana instructed Action to swallow the soma and began to offer more guidance, but Action, impatient, swallowed the soma without waiting. He immediately swung his sword backward, prompting Vihana to shout for him to wait. But Action unleashed his attack, and a dragon force erupted, cutting deep into the wall. Vihana, speechless, realized that the participants had surprised him several times today. Action's slash crossed over Theo's, leaving a similar deep mark that could be seen even from a distance. Vihana then announced that Action had passed, but the crowd was in disbelief. The slashes made by Action and Theo were almost identical, leading many to wonder who had won. As Action glanced at the wall, he overheard participants whispering that the precision grading would likely determine the victor. Without a word, he turned and left the stage. A short while later, after thoroughly examining the wall, Vihana addressed the participants, announcing that the first stage of the awakening ceremony was officially over. He commended them for their excellent work, noting how this year had brought many impressive performances and significantly improved scores. Vihana informed those who passed to prepare for the second stage of the awakening ceremony, scheduled to take place in 4 days. Finally, Vihana raised his voice, signaling that it was time to announce the rankings that everyone had been eagerly awaiting. He prepared to reveal the valedictorian for the first stage of the awakening ceremony.